Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. We have people connected from US, Europe, and Asia. So it's day 4 of the PRI Academic Week. I hope that you've been following us in the last 3 days. And today, we have another set of exciting papers on essentially equity. The papers will focus, there will be a focus on engagement. We'll start with the paper on engagement, but we'll talk about divestment and engagement in decarbonization. And this is, again, following up the days we have had on carbon risk. So it's a really great afternoon ahead of us. So this conference, again, just let me thank the chair, Caroline Flammer, and the co-organizer, Laura Starks and Pedro Matos, who have been helping, all together with, I think, they have put together a great program. And we've done that every day. So if you've been connecting, sorry for perhaps repeating some same idea. But I think if you're new to this event, so this is part of a series of activity that as PRI Academic Network, we have been doing for several years. And some of this, there is kind of material that is available online with a review of potential data sets for researcher. There is academic ESG review, targeted also more at practitioners, a podcast, a series of blogs translating the most interesting new academic research. And there is also an academic series which convenes, and you can find the information online, which is an opportunity for scholars to present their work like we are doing in this week, to an audience of academic and practitioners. So, and as everything within the PRI Academic Network, there is papers, research across discipline. Like today, we have first paper in law, we have then papers in finance, other days we've had papers in management, accounting, economics. So the idea, for the academic series is to continue what we're doing this week, throughout the year. So if you have not followed any of these, you can sign up online for this year's program. So today, I'm very glad, I'm happy to be moderating this, what looks like a great session. We have a paper on systematic ownership by Jeffrey Gordon, who is connecting from Columbia University, and Ed Rock from NYU will be the academic discussant, and Carly Greenberg from PRI, the practitioners. Then we move to a paper in finance presented by Vasca Atadarqua and co-authored by Simon Glosser, Philip Kroger, and Pedro Matos, which will be discussed by Hao Liang from Singapore Management University and Rossi Farr from PRI. And finally, Doron Levitt from University of Washington will present a paper on socially responsible divestment, a co-author with Alex Edmonds from LBS and Jan Schneimer from Indiana University. And Lian Shen from INSEAD and Lloyd Kurtz from Wells Fargo will be discussing the paper. So paper, in law, an empirical paper in finance, and a theory paper. So again, a great diversity of paper, and I think there will be an interesting discussion as well after all the 3 papers have been presenting. Just a reminder on the kind of Zoom rules for the session. And so we'll have 20 minutes presentation of the authors with 10 minutes for each discussion. And then I will ask the authors to reply to some of the issues if they want to reply to the issues raised by the discussant. And then finally, we'll go to a more general Q&A. If please, all of you, try to, feel free to engage as much as you can, through the chat. And when we open up for general Q&A, by raising your hand. So I'll be monitoring the chat, and I might ask you actually to ask the question in person if you want to do that, or I can read the questions. But let's make this as interactive as possible, as we've done that in the first few days. So everybody's probably very familiar with the Zoom tool by now. But just in case, here are a few, reminder on how to navigate the interface. So without further ado, let's move to the first paper, and it's a great pleasure to have Jeffrey Gordon from Columbia Law School with us to present his paper on systematic stewardship. The floor is yours. I will stop sharing and you can share your slide. Oops.
Okay, let's see. Here we go. Is that sharing? Yeah, great. I was going to say we've had the good fortune this semester to become a little bit less adept on Zoom skills as my classes have begun to meet in person and seminars as well. So that's a happy bit of rustiness. Anyway, so today I'd like to present a paper on systematic stewardship. So what is systematic stewardship? What's the appeal of it? The goal is to provide a foundation for a form of pro-social engagement by large investors, asset managers especially, with their portfolio companies and with the broader governance environment that fits both their theory of investing and also their low-cost business model. And the claim of systematic stewardship is that it provides a finance theory approach for such investors to address some of the most serious issues we face: climate change issue, financial stability, and perhaps even social stability. And the core idea on this finance theory approach is that it's really drawn directly from modern portfolio theory. Investors want to maximize risk-adjusted returns, not simply expected returns. Portfolio diversification permits the elimination of idiosyncratic risk, but not systematic risk. The possibilities to increase expected returns for the portfolio have limits because most firm-specific interventions are idiosyncratic. So the plausible goal for a widely diversified investor like an index fund is to reduce systematic risk. The important piece of this for the PRI folks is that this is not a trade-off model. This is not a model that says we should expect that we should accept lower risk-adjusted returns in exchange for example, taking on the climate change issue. Rather, it's to accept the fact, to realize that climate change presents systematic risk, and managing that risk, mitigating that risk, will enhance risk-adjusted returns. So therefore, for a broadly diversified investor like an index fund, addressing a systematic risk like the climate change risk is not driven by socially responsible investing, but finance theory in the hunt for the best risk-adjusted returns. So one reason that I think this has appeal is it's politically less exposed for an asset manager. What I'm doing is trying to maximize the risk-adjusted returns for my beneficiaries, and it requires me to take on the mitigation of certain systematic risks, but that's because I'm a finance theory-driven manager working for the beneficiaries. This is not a claim about universal ownership, internalizing all the externalities. This isn't that broad. It's limited to a set of issues for which diversified shareholder interests on this finance theory model overlap for issues of social concern. So it's a finance theory-based conception of welfare, not a general theory of social welfare. But nevertheless, I think it's a promising route to make headway on some wicked hard issues that, again, precisely because it's finance theory based, not socially responsibility based, has the possibility for greater consensus and less friction with political actors. So to summarize the rest of the talk, first, an introduction to stewardship, a brief discussion of the nature of systematic risks, a suggestion of what some of those systematic risks might be, some sketching as to how systematic stewardship might be implemented at the portfolio level and at the firm level. And the choices are, do we empower the activists? Do we empower the management of the firms? Do the asset managers take their own actions? Finally, this is sort of by way of rebuttal, perhaps anticipation of Professor Rock, with whom I've discussed these issues, some rebuttal to the common ownership critique and some rebuttal to the claim that the systematic approach violates the usual notions of governance, in that it's a multi-firm approach as opposed to a single firm focus. All right, so first, the origins of stewardship. The idea of stewardship really arises because of the intersection of two different phenomena. First is the reconcentration of ownership into the hands of institutional investors, which overcomes the collective action problems of dispersed share ownership. So the reconcentration, in effect, potentiates the idea of shareholder voice. Second, there is a global governance deficit. These global firms, multinational firms, are both the cause of many difficult issues, but also perhaps the avenue for solution to them. And the stewardship argument arises because the shareholders, unlike governments, do have power over firms that are otherwise too big to govern. And the shareholders, unlike governments, have transnational governance rights.
Acho que eu fiz uma M aqui, deixa eu tentar compartilhar minha tela, que eu preciso fazer uma remissão de fatura. Aí
Hello? Yeah. Am I being, for some reason, it
Yes,
got
yes, they muted all of us because there was some noise. So you can go ahead, you can continue.
All right, so anyway, maybe I'll rehearse the origins of stewardship. First, reconcentration of share ownership in the hands of these owners. Secondly, the global governance issue here. And the shareholders, unlike governments themselves, actually have transnational governance rights. And here's the big move, I think, in the overall stewardship claim. It starts as an idea simply that the large institutional owners should vote as informed shareholders, but has really morphed into a call for accepting additional responsibility, most specifically in the EU, with this focus on sustainability. So the sustainability focus becomes a way in which governments attempt to transfer a certain set of values onto how stewardship ought to be exercised by the large owners, and is an effort to, via the stewardship structure, to convert these large owners into instruments of the government itself. Anyway, so the idea, so stewardship has an incomplete fit with the idea of universal owners, the idea that because the shareholders own because these large shareholders have diversified portfolios, they own all the securities in the market that they'll internalize all the externalities, which would put, of course, these investors in the position of a benevolent planner. The reason that universal ownership doesn't quite fit is because the distribution of share ownership is skewed. The top 10, top 1% owns most of the shares. The bottom half owns very little. Even if you take into account defined benefit pension plans. You know, the idea that these universal owners would have the right incentives to internalize in the right way seems belied by the actual facts of ownership. And so, as I say, this is one reason I think that governments have attempted to use the EU example, the EU case, sustainability as a model, which is a social model, traveling through stewardship to the asset owners. You know, it's an effort, in effect, to force these universal owners to internalize these broader goals. All right, so going back to the origins of stewardship, the more general issue with stewardship is the business model of the asset manager. And here, maybe I have more of a US focus. Because most of the institutional investors operate under a business model in which asset managers are compensated for superior relative performance measured in stock market returns. So they compete on relative performance, they compete on the basis of low fees. So we have a high degree of diversification. We have a broad-based index fund, passively invested. That's the limit case. And so if you see the focus on relative performance, the index fund strategy, and the goal for low fees, the issue is whether stewardship really is compatible with, which involves very perhaps detailed firm-specific engagement. Is that consistent with the business model that we have? So what's the kind of stewardship that we see, given the nature of these funds and the business model? One of which is that we see the guidelines as to how to vote across the portfolio as a whole. That's current. That's obviously, it addresses the diversification and the low cost. In effect, there's a model in which these funds rationally reticent, in the sense they're not forward leaning on proposals, but they will act responsibly to them. With the hedge funds, for example, the hedge funds tee up proposals and the institutions will vote on them. So that's a potential model that this sort of steward might use. What about performance focused on an individual fund engagement model? Mostly no. As Bev, Chuck, and Hurst show, and the reason for that, of course, is the fees, the costs. So, is ESG really E&S, environment and social stewardship, really possible or feasible? And the claim is that the systematic stewardship model fits this because it takes advantage of extensive diversification and the low-cost business model. All right, so what is systematic risk? It's the risk that can't be diversified away in modern portfolio theory. And the claim that I make is that a major source of systematic risk essentially is the risk of rare disasters, the black swans, the green swans that overhangs markets. And indeed, some finance scholars have suggested this accounts for a significant part of the equity premium that we see. That's one point. The second point is that systematic risk can be modified. Indeed, this is what Basel is all about, right? Trying to reduce the risk of further financial instability. And so the claim is that we're able to reduce systematic risk if we're smart in the way that we do it. So climate change is obviously a target of systematic risk reduction. I don't have to explain to this group the systematic threats that climate change entails. Financial stability risk, that's another systematic risk, as we've seen dramatically in 0709. And then again, as I say, Basel is all about trying to target that. Social stability risk, I have a part in the paper, which I don't think I'm going to discuss here because of time, in which I suggest that actually the very nature of modern diversification enhances social stability risk, and therefore may be a special reason why diversified investors ought to think about how to mitigate it, but that's a separate point, sort of elaborate to set up. So how might systematic stewardship be implemented? One strategy is to empower the ESG activists through voting. That's the engine number one case. Essentially, they put up a slate and you vote for them. Another way is to empower the managers of the target firms through voting as well. So if a performance activist shows up, a hedge fund that, for example, wants a firm to pursue a more aggressive fossil fuel strategy than management would want, then a systematic steward could vote in favor of the management team and resist the hedge fund. There are other possibilities, such as the fund might put out general portfolio guidelines as to how it would vote on shareholder proposals.
You have 3 minutes, okay?
Okay, right.
Thank you.
Oh, 3? Wow. Okay. So let me just say, by way of rebuttal, of a couple things. The common ownership critique. The basic concern is that this collective action may, in fact, raise price. The difference is that in reducing systematic risk, yes, you're going to improve performance for the portfolio, but the point is you are eliminating harm to society in general. And so the claim is that the antitrust goals here ought not limit a party who's trying to prevent a generalized harm that would affect everyone in the real economy. The second sort of rebuttal is to, this single firm versus multi-firm focus. The claim is that the benefit is to the portfolio as a whole and puts at risk returns to the individual firm. And this violates the governance norms that we have, which presumably are a single firm focus. The claim I want to make is that we've already crossed that bridge. So the governance guidelines that these systematic stewards already put in place, which, for example, have in effect a one-size-fits-all approach to classified boards and many other governance features, already are looking to how to increase the performance of the portfolio at the expense of a firm by firm. Similarly, the very idea of portfolio diversification, which means that we promote more aggressive single firm risk taking, we promote the idea of minimizing diversification at single firms, which increase the failure risk at the single firm. This too already we're following a portfolio approach as opposed to a single firm approach. So there's nothing new in systematic stewardship as applied to the effort to mitigate systematic risk in the way that I've proposed. So I think I'll stop there.
You still have a minute, so you can finish. Last slide, go ahead, and then we move.
Well, again, it's so systematic stewardship, I think, presents an approach that asset managers could in fact follow, that precisely because it's finance-based, doesn't raise the sum of the political issues, the pushback that some have made, and to be sure, it is a way to address a limited set of issues, but a very important set of issues.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we have two discussants, and the first discussant is an academic discussant, Edward Rock from NYU.
Thank you. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to talk about Jeff's paper. It's a paper I like very much. And as you can tell from the end of Jeff's presentation, that it's a topic that we have discussed at quite substantial length. Indeed, my views of this are in large part formed as a reaction to Jeff's views in a series of lovely walks in Riverside Park. The promise of universal ownership, or of universal owners, or large, huge, very diversified investors is real. The largest asset managers own large stakes in thousands of companies. At the same time as there are serious threats to humanity that the political branches are not addressing. And Jeff touched on some of these: carbon, financial risk, inequality. And as Jeff points out, these threats affect the whole portfolio. If we can't control systematic risk, the value of the portfolio could go down possibly to zero. If politicians won't or can't address these issues, maybe these huge, highly diversified, widely diversified asset managers can. Now, it's important to realize that this is the classic problem of externalities. This is the problem that we have dealt with over the years. It's the problem that Jeff identifies as the problem of systematic risk. There are folks out there now pushing for large asset managers to take a more systematic risk approach. So Rick Alexander at Shareholder Commons has been leading the charge on this. He brought a shareholder proposal at BlackRock in last spring's proxy statement, in which he asked essentially that BlackRock adopt a version of Jeff's proposal. And as Jeff has so clearly explained, it's unwise for universal owners or managers or any highly diversified investment advisor to pursue firm-specific performance-focused engagement. Instead, they should seek to mitigate systematic risk, and doing so will improve the risk-adjusted portfolio returns. Now, what I want to argue, and what Jeff pointed out at the end of his presentation, is that this sort of systemic or systematic stewardship is in substantial tension with existing corporate law and corporate governance. And it seems to me that the robust implementation of this kind of strategy requires legal change, institutional change, political change, cultural change among asset managers. And if the problem we're faced in terms of controlling externalities is political paralysis, it's not clear that any of this will occur at the scale necessary to address the problems. So let me start with the basic architecture of corporate law and corporate governance. In the traditional statement, the objective of a corporation is to enhance the economic value of the corporation within the boundaries of law for the benefit of the corporation's shareholders. This is drawn from the current draft of the American Law Institute's restatement of the law of corporate governance, for which I'm the reporter and for which Jeff is one of the advisors. Now note, on this traditional view, the goal is to promote the value of this corporation, right? The core injunction is to enhance the economic value of this corporation. For whose benefit? For the benefit of this corporation's group of shareholders as distinguished from other interests. Note that the objective is not to promote shareholder value or welfare. Shareholder value is often a useful proxy, a useful rule of thumb because it's a useful proxy for firm value. And on this traditional model, externalities are controlled by the law, the phrase within the boundaries of the law. And we've seen and we know and we teach how this fundamental focus is implemented. It's implemented through directors and officers' understanding of their role. It's implemented through senior managers' financial incentives. So you look at compensation contracts and they are overwhelmingly single firm focused. And there is limited judicial policing of extreme cases. Now note, and here's where Jeff's approach and what I'm arguing now diverge. Corporate law focuses on directors and officers. Jeff is focusing on shareholders. And it seems to me the problem in the tension is at the intersection of the two. In the traditional view, whether you're a managerialist, as was popular up until the 80s, or a shareholderist since the 1980s, in both cases, it's about promoting the value of individual firms. And the goal is something of a constrained maximization task, promote the value of the corporation within the boundaries of the law. And that's assuming that other areas of law do their job. This promotes social welfare. It's a straightforward application of Adam Smith. It's consistent with an application of the general justification of capitalism. Now, where systematic stewardship enters the analysis is in the argument the other areas of the law do not do their job. And so shareholders need to take on the task. And it seems to me that this has given birth to a new family of views, which I would label corporate governance welfarism. And it comes in really three flavors. There's the portfolio welfarism that I think Jeff is pushing, Madison Condon pushes, Rick Alexander at Shareholder Commons is pushing, which is, then there's a shareholder welfarism, which Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales' recent work is pushing and is typified by the title of the first paper in this series, Companies Should Maximize Shareholder Welfare, Not Market Value or Share Value. And then there's a direct social welfarism that seeks to transform the objective function of the firm so that it is consistent with social welfare that Colin Mayer is pushing. For the family of views that I think Jeff is part of, namely portfolio welfarism, the portfolio maximizing strategy takes into account that negative externalities from one company may harm other companies in the portfolio. Now, Jeff says this is not a trade-off strategy. And in the sense that Jeff uses that, he's right. It's not a trade-off between risk and return. It's not a trade-off in that sense. But it is a trade-off because on this portfolio maximizing strategy, you push individual portfolio companies to refrain from activities that generate negative externalities, even if doing so reduces firm value. So that there, in that sense, you might pressure ExxonMobil to reduce its carbon output because of the effect on the rest of the portfolio, or you might push JP Morgan Chase to reduce its leverage because of the effect on the rest of the portfolio of financial risk. Now, the link to social welfare here is, as Jeff points out, the intra-portfolio externalities are often, not always, but often also social externalities. Now, I think the importance of the common ownership critique that's associated with Azar Schmaltz and Teko's Airlines paper is that competition is also an intra-portfolio externality, so that the fit between portfolio welfarism and overall social welfare is going to be incomplete. Now, it might seem to be just an incremental shift from maximizing firm value to maximizing portfolio value, because in both cases, and this is the argument Jeff's making, both cases you're still focusing on shareholders. But it seems to me it's a much more fundamental shift than one might otherwise realize, because of this shift from single firm focus to multi-firm focus. And it seems to me that implementing this requires a lot of work. On the legal side, when there are serious trade-offs, for instance, the idea that you might push ExxonMobil to cut its output of carbon by 40%, even if it leads to a drop in the stock price by 20%, because the benefit to the rest of the portfolio is net positive. Take that as the example, which is an example that Madison Condon works out. There you have a serious trade-off. Now, that it seems to me, and in the paper that Jeff referenced, Systemic Stewardship with Trade-offs, that Marcel Kahan and I have written, there it seems to me there is a serious conflict with the duty of loyalty under traditional corporate law. Now, why do I focus on portfolio welfarism with serious trade-offs? Simply because I think the only way we can make progress on things like carbon or things like systemic risk from the financial sector is with serious trade-offs. That there are a group of firms in every large asset manager's portfolio who will be hurt if we in fact take a robust approach to portfolio welfarism with respect to carbon. On the institutional level,
we have to, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just about finished. On the institutional level, managerial compensation is overwhelmingly single firm focused. And a shift to portfolio welfarism requires changing that. And it's indeed the extent to which management compensation is other firm focused or portfolio focused that the common ownership literature points to as the way in which common ownership reduces competition in concentrated markets. From the political perspective, trade-offs will often induce backlash. And we're already seeing in the US a serious backlash against ESG. And finally, there's a cultural or ideological change necessary in the boardroom, because officers and directors genuinely believe that their role is to enhance the value of their firm and not to concern themselves with the portfolio interests of their large shareholders. So let me stop here. And thanks again.
Thank you very much.
And it's a great paper.
Thank you both. And please, I'll invite Carly Greenberg from PRI.
Awesome. I'm here. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, first of all, hello, everyone. And thank you so much, Jeff, for making your paper available to PRI's community, as well as thank you to Ed and for your views and Fabrizio for moderating this session. Just as a quick introduction, my name is Carly. I am a senior specialist here at PRI focusing on stewardship and specifically our active ownership 2.0 work streams. Prior to PRI, I amassed experience on ESG from both sides of the aisle. And by that, I mean I have close to a decade of experience as an ESG practitioner for an asset manager. And directly prior to PRI, I spent a few years working in-house at a Fortune 500 company where I was their first hire on environmental sustainability and oversaw their ESG reporting efforts. So I'm bringing to this virtual table experience doing shareholder engagement, such as voting proxies and filing shareholder proposals, as well as experience being engaged by investors and now being in a position to create resources for other investors so that they may pursue more effective stewardship. Since our time together today is short, I wanted to focus my remarks on 3 particular points where I believe Professor Gordon's research adds value to the investment field. And those are on fiduciary duty, establishing voting principles, and acting in concert. So let's start with fiduciary duty. As I'm sure many on the line know, on August 4th, 2022, the Attorney Generals of 19 states issued a letter to BlackRock. In it, they alleged that the firm's support for net zero by 2050 violated fiduciary duty because it diverted from the sole focus on financial returns, especially in light of the fact that most governments have not yet implemented their own net zero mandates. Jeff's research seems to come as a direct response to these allegations. Investment theory tells us that expected growth in real earnings per share should approximately track real GDP growth rate. In the paper, Jeff cites a roughly 1.2% loss of GDP for each degree centigrade rise in global temperatures. Similarly, in 2018, the University of Oxford found that only at a 1.5 degrees Celsius world can we expect economic growth to be as close to indistinguishable from current climate conditions. By contrast, if we rise to a 2-degree world, Oxford predicts statistically significant contractions in economic growth for a large set of countries, with median projected annual growth rates being up to 2% lower. Scientists, economists, and other researchers are frequently uniting in telling us that climate change will have an economic impact, and economic and financial value will be lost. Now, no one will argue the fact that government action is needed. I do not think anyone is out there claiming that investors can do this on their own. But just as we would not expect someone to stay in the middle of train tracks as an oncoming train approaches just because, hey, they're already standing there, we should not accept that it would be wise for investors to continue on as business as usual in the face of a looming climate crisis, just because that's where investors currently are. We know we are on a collision course, and hanging all of our expectations on government to get us out of harm's way could prove suicidal. There's broad agreement that fiduciary duty at a very minimum encompasses preserving financial value for clients. Many would also argue, as the state attorney generals did, that achieving a financial return is also part of fiduciary duty. What Jeff and these other researchers made clear is that doing nothing destroys value because of the relationship between climate and economic growth. When I was going through business school, and even when I was sitting for the CFA, I was never taught that systemic risk is something investors could impact. And I cannot help but wonder how many other folks were taught the exact same thing, that systemic risk is just a given. What I appreciate about Professor Gordon's paper is that he is bringing a new viewpoint into the narrative, where students and practitioners of finance should no longer accept that systemic risk is unchangeable. Instead, due to their role as market practitioners, systemic risk is very much something that investors can impact, and that they have a fiduciary duty to do so from the standpoint of achieving risk-adjusted returns. Secondly, I believe Professor Gordon's work dovetails nicely into a recent thought leadership piece that my colleagues at PRI produced last year on the development of principles-based proxy voting. In a nutshell, that report, called Making Voting Count, encouraged investors to develop high-level statements that explain the investor's position on ESG issues and how they vote to affect progress on those issues. I think Jeff pointed out a really good justification for this practice that admittedly I think we missed, which is that for investors who operate in a low-fee business model, and even quite frankly for all investors who face downward fee pressure these days, having a North Star best practice that you apply uniformly across the portfolio reduces costs. I like that he also pointed out that when it comes to governance, investors are by and large already doing this. Many investors agree on what is considered best practice governance, yet for some reason, there has been more quibbling about shades of gray when it comes to best practice on environmental and social practices. I think especially as it relates to climate change, though, the bright lines are there, and the current approach by most firms to evaluate climate proposals on a case-by-case basis accrues time and costs. Now, I recognize that not all climate proposals are created equal, but increasingly, folks are coalescing around the idea that science-based targets and transitioning businesses to operate in line with the 1.5-degree climate pathway is best practice. Heck, my old boss at the Fortune 500 company even claimed that doing so was table stakes. Now, I'm not sure that the acceptance of the state, I feel that the acceptance of the state probably varies drastically between the different sectors, but corporations' ability to understand this and get on board is possible. So you may be saying to yourselves then, hey, if they're getting it, why does it matter if we as investors vote for these proposals or not? Well, the reason is because not voting on these things sends a really confusing message to companies about where investors stand. Frequently, the way it works in a firm is that the investor calls are handled by the sustainability team, and the proxy voting filters into the realm of the corporate secretary or general counsel and the board. In firms where ESG is new, these teams might actually be quite siloed from each other, which means that if you as an investor have a productive chat with the sustainability team and then take that as license to vote in support of management against a shareholder proposal on climate change, that's going to send a very confusing message to the company. The sustainability team may believe it has the investor support, but that support is not being communicated to the board at the board level through the proxy vote. So in addition, I want to double down on something that Professor Gordon talks about in his paper about this phenomenon called governance externalities, where firms will see what's happening at other companies and then mend their practices as a result. And I just wanted to double click on this and say that it is a real phenomenon. When the shareholder proposal at Costco to set a science-based greenhouse gas reduction goal last year got approximately 70% support, it sent a powerful message to all the companies who are within Costco's supply chain. And I know this because I used to work at one of those companies, and we were really pleased to see we were already doing the right things, that we could be a productive partner for one of our customers. Lastly, on acting in concert. Now, I will say I'm not a lawyer, no surprise there, nor have I worked for a company that has had acting in concert concerns seriously lobbed at it. But I did find Jeff's arguments to be interesting, and I appreciate that he's entered them into the marketplace of ideas. And I do wonder if some of our signatories who are facing these concerns might find comfort in the logic. I appreciate the point that the spirit of antitrust laws are centered around consumer protection. And if investors are collaborating in a way that does not harm consumers and protects economic, ecological, and social systems, might that actually mean these investors are not in violation of the spirit of these rules? Unfortunately, in the US, political discourse often devolves into encouraging people to, quote, stay in their lane. But in reading Professor Gordon's paper, I increasingly felt emboldened to say, hey, oh, okay, great. I'm about to conclude. Hey, economic stability is an investor's lane. So just to conclude, if I had to pick one thing that I wish the paper went into more detail on, it would be in doing more to develop a distinction between when an engagement counts as idiosyncratic focus versus systematic. I think by focusing on just three main systematic stewardship themes, the paper wrongly gives the impression that other current shareholder engagement efforts are focused only at firm idiosyncratic risk, whereas I don't actually think that's the case. Also, it would have been helpful for Dr. Gordon to go deeper into issues that are tied to these larger systematic stewardship themes, but have very localized components to them. So for example, water, deforestation, biodiversity, very much so tied to climate change, yet distinct, and also very localized issues in their own right. And we can also see that these local issues still have global scale impact, such as when water tables in the Rhine were so low this summer as to disrupt trade. And with that, I thank you again, Jeff, for making your paper available, and I will turn things back to Fabrizio.
Thank you, Carly, and thank you to Jeffrey and Edward for the paper and the discussion. Jeffrey, do you want to respond to the discussants or add, clarify something, or go ahead, the floor is yours.
Yeah, maybe a couple of thoughts. On Ed Rock's point about the reorientation from a single firm focus, I guess since this is a more elaborate discussion, but the shareholders elect directors. The directors have great discretion within the business judgment rule to run the firm. The law simply does not require firms to be run in a way that is unheeding of the externalities that they create, even if they're not constrained by law in the way the firm is run. So I think that as a legal matter, directors who have a consensus that the firm should be run in a specific way that does not maximize, in some financial sense, returns, but trades off running the firm in that way to minimize externalities. Seems to me that that would be would not violate the law, at least as I understand it. Whether the shareholders would vote in that way is a somewhat different issue. But this may require further hashing out. I appreciate Carla's point about the fact that, in a sense, my approach to systematic stewardship is a little, I mean, it could gain another leg in a sense, which she's saying. So I focused on the risk elements of it. In other words, that an abrupt, non-linear change because of climate change risk, and ice, the Greenland ice shelf slides off and the sea level rises, or the Gulf Stream stops flowing, that would have an immediate dramatic effect on the global economy, like the failure of Lehman Brothers, and that's a risk which could be addressed. Her point is that without that unless we're able to sustain a 1.5 centigrade rise, unless we're able to cap it at that, then the predictable effects will be to reduce economic growth globally, and thus will have a portfolio effect. So the it's that expected returns would be predictably lower unless we're able to hold to the 1.5 limit. So it's both a portfolio approach that looks to both impact on expected returns across the portfolio, as well as the risks of some sort of nonlinear shock. So that's a kind of, I mean, I should to take that. I mean, that's a nice way to frame it. And both of these things, of course, are a good rebuttal to this August letter challenging the way that fiduciaries are thinking about these systematic risks.
Fabrizio, can I just follow up on that? So
Sure.
I agree with Jeff that in most cases of systematic stewardship, there's going to be minimal legal risk on the directors, largely because the magnitude, it seems to me, of whatever trade-offs there are, the magnitude is not going to be sufficiently large to trigger any sort of serious legal risk. I think the big battle here is, and I think this is where Jeff is ultimately targeting, the big battle here has to do with what you might refer to as the ideology of the boardroom and the ideology of asset management. That is to say, the collective self-understanding of what we're trying to do when we're directors of a public company, what we're trying to do when we're asset managers. And I think where the law comes in is to provide to fill out the role of director. And the existing law very much is oriented towards single firm focus. The existing law supports and builds on this notion that your job is to maximize the value of your firm. That's your primary job. And on the asset management side, it seems to me, notwithstanding the state AG's letter, there's plenty of flexibility to consider systematic risk among asset managers. What's interesting, of course, is that politically, there's pushback. So in response to Rick Alexander's shareholder proposal at BlackRock, asking BlackRock, the quintessential multi-firm focused universal asset manager, to take a systemic stewardship approach, BlackRock, the firm, pushed back. They recommended voting against it. And they recommended voting against it because they say, we're primarily single firm focused. We look at in engaging with companies, we look at whether they're doing a good job maximizing or promoting the value of their company. That even BlackRock is uncomfortable publicly embracing the kind of systemic stewardship. Now, is that because of legal risk or political risk? I would suggest it's much more political risk. So that really the battle here is for the ideology of these two sectors. The current, the Marty Lipton's new paradigm is all about getting asset managers to reorient themselves away from what he would describe as short-term share value maximization or total shareholder return.
Thank you very much. So, actually, maybe if I may, I might take my moderator privilege to bring back one comment of Carly, and that also in relation to what you just said, because I think Carly was saying, there seems to be sometimes a false tension between the single firm engagement and the systemic risk one, because in practice, Carly, I hope I'm not reading you wrong, but in practice, there could be an engagement targeted at one firm that is essentially, this is done, for instance, in relation to a systemic risk around climate change. And we know there is large evidence that firms are looking at each other, and there is essentially mimetic effect, tons of articles on the Nixon in China effect. So you target one player, but your goal is to set an example, is to get everybody to change. The way you do it is by doing one engagement with one firm. So I think it's interesting because by definition you're not going to go on all of. So you are trying to deal with systematic risk, specifically maybe on climate change. But you are doing it that through. So I think, what do you think? So is that, so as you're saying, perhaps there is a difference between the legal framework that you have to say, I can only do it at the single risk, and maybe I need to change the legal framework, and the practice where it seems to me that there is already an attempt, at least in some cases, to achieve the systemic change by targeting one or very few firms. So I guess this is for Jeffrey, or I had probably both of you might address it.
Well, right. So the idea of one firm is an example, and then other firms don't want to be pilloried in the same way, so they'll accommodate. I sort of come at the single firm target a little bit differently, at least, thinking from a US perspective. So what's the advantage of ExxonMobil, the action that happened there? Here, to my way of thinking, it's less that other firms in the fossil fuel business will change their behavior because they saw what happened at Exxon. In fact, you do run some risk that they'll try to take advantage of the fact that a competitor has been hampered to maybe increase their own exploration. Rather, it's the way that the way that the shareholder activity is nested in politics and government. So maybe the biggest effect of the success at ExxonMobil is to lead to a change in the lobbying activity of the firm. So if we think that one of the major impediments to government action to address climate change risk has been the concerted lobbying activity by these firms, the concerted denialism, which has made it much harder for there to be a positive political response, then maybe, and this, I guess, is a fact to be verified, observed, the impact here is not that other firms will imitate Exxon directly, but rather the political environment in which this whole issue is considered will change. And that's kind of, to me, pretty significant, because as I think was said earlier, surely, as Carly said, there needs to be a government role here. No amount of shareholder activity is going to solve this issue. And so maybe thinking more in a more rigorous way about the interaction between the activity of the shareholders, the political engagement by firms, and the overall political environment, nest this thing in a model of a broader political space than, just a debate about what the shareholders ought to be doing on their own.
Thank you. And again, I know that there might be more questions, which we might want to actually leave for the general Q&A as we also go through the other two papers. Thank you very much for all of you. And then we can now move to the second paper, Decarbonizing Institutional Investor Portfolios. And Vasca Atadarqua from University of Virginia from Darden will be presenting a paper co-authored with Simon Glossner, Philip Krueger, and Pedro Matos. The floor is yours, Vasca. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Can everyone see the slides all right?
Yes.
Yep. Perfect. Great. So this paper is actually going to continue some of the conversations we have been having about shareholders. It's called Decarbonizing Institutional Investor Portfolios. As Fabrizio said, it's joint work with my colleagues, Simon Glossner at the Federal Reserve Board, Pedro Matos, who is also at Darden, and Philip Krueger in Geneva. Because Simon is at the Federal Reserve Board, the usual disclaimer applies. Now, we wanted to answer the question about one of the ways to address global warming. As we've discussed before, and it came up in the discussions of the previous paper, climate scientists have put numerous reports suggesting that we need to drastically reduce carbon emissions, or else we're going to have adverse impacts. Temperatures are going to rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius, which could have bad impacts on the flora, fauna, our lives, also the economy. As financial people, we should not forget. And the idea is, how do we achieve that? As an economist, we would say this is an externality, so we just need to put a carbon tax. Unfortunately, the coordination across global governments to achieve this, it has been very hard to get that coordination done. There's a number of reasons for that. Here, one of the pictures I've put suggests that historically, different countries have been responsible for historic emissions versus current emissions. Developed countries have done most of the historic. Now developing countries are doing a lot of the current emissions. But is it fair to expect them to, slow growth to curb their emissions? It's a difficult task. Also, there have been a lot of targets and commitments that governments have made, but a lot of the drastic reductions in emissions are far into the future, making them slightly less believable to achieve and credible. And finally, even if we do actually do all these cuts that have been promised by governments and other bodies, it still seems that there's a large emissions gap to be filled to actually keep the emissions growing to up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there has been a call for the finance sector and investors in particular to also help address the climate challenge. Why? Well, as owners of a lot of public companies, they kind of benefit from the fact that these carbon emissions are not priced correctly and firms have higher profits than they would if there was a carbon tax. So we decided to look at that and see, can these investor coalitions help and resolve the problem? First, we do want to acknowledge that public companies are not the only ones that have emissions. There is a large part of emission also outside of the public markets. And just looking at the problem, like with a bit of a magnifying glass, even within the public sectors, there is a lot of concentration of emissions within specific sectors. But we wanted to answer the question, all of these climate organizations have been created. Have they actually, these investors who are part of these organizations, have they been decarbonizing their portfolios? That's the first question. Then if they have, how have they achieved that decarbonization? Is it in a way that also helps to solve the general emissions problem? And finally, they go in and looking beyond carbon emissions at other measures which can perhaps help us to achieve a green transition, because simply just reducing global emissions is not enough for us to have a sustainable lifestyles. We need to also increase green energy sources, etc. So we're going to look at all of these three questions. And just to say, just to give a preview of the results, we combined global data on institutional investors' equity holdings with firm-level emissions to create portfolio-level emissions for those investors. We focus on climate-conscious investors, and we find that those actively decarbonized their equity portfolios between 2005 and 2019, which is the period over which we have our sample. We hypothesize this can be achieved by two primary methods. One is tilting portfolio holdings away from the worst performing companies towards lower emitting companies. And the other is by engaging with portfolio firms to actually reduce the emissions of the firms that you hold. And after conducting our analysis, our findings suggest that tilting seems to be the predominant strategies that is employed, and in particular also by European climate conscious investors. But we do uncover some evidence of engagement, which is over the longer term with the worst emitting firms, and also following the Paris Agreement of 2015. So then we look beyond carbon emissions, and we do find that climate conscious investors have portfolios with higher green revenue percentage, but not green patents. Now, let's go over this, how do we get there? Oh, first, related literature. We're contributing to a number of strands of literature, the broader ESG investing literature, also the climate finance in terms of the performance of firms, which we also saw a bit of that yesterday, also how investors should approach climate risk, and the perennial debates on divestment versus engagement, voice versus exit. We try and add a bit to those literatures. The data we use, as I mentioned, first, an important addition we have is we look at the investor list of two climate conscious investor initiatives, the CDP and the Climate Action 100+. The majority of the analysis is with the CDP because that initiative spans a whole analysis period, and climate action comes a bit later. The main difference between these two initiatives is CDP is more on the disclosure. It was formed when there was almost no climate disclosure, and investors would send letters to portfolio firms and ask them to actually tell us what your emissions are. And after they changed the scene by making emissions disclosures a bit more prevalent, then following the Paris Agreement, Climate Action 100+ came, and actually their main role is to engage with firms and to encourage them to reduce emissions. So difference, one is disclosure, the second one is engagement. One has been around for a while. The second one has just arrived quite recently. And one has over 2,000 trillion equity AUM. The other one is about 5, but they're both growing. We combine this with the FactSet institutional ownership data, where we can match different firms to different investors and how much they own of them. We combine this with true cost emissions data, which I will briefly describe on the next slide. And then we also look at CDP targets to see, is there more portfolio targets in the investor portfolios, like firm targets. We look at green revenues, data from FTSE Russell, and also we add green patents. Now, emissions, we have discussed this a bit yesterday, but to give a recap, the different scopes of emissions, and true cost covers over 15,000 firms. Some of them are disclosing, some of them are also estimated. Overall, they cover more than 95% of the global market cap. Scope 1 emissions, this is the emissions that are within the control of your firm, that they're released in your operations, also vehicles within your firm buildings. Then you have Scope 2 emissions, which are indirect, they're the energy you purchase, how green is your energy grid, or how much of the emissions are coming from carbon intensive operations. And then Scope 3 can be both the upstream and downstream. So this could be the emissions which were created in your inputs, like to produce the inputs to your productions, or also as people use your products, the emissions that they incur in that way. So we primarily look at Scope 1 because these are direct, and also to avoid double counting by summing the others. But we do show results for 2 and 3 with true cost measuring the upstream 3 emissions. Yeah, again, like one of the final slides setting the scene. just looking at the total global emissions on the left side, there is also a lot of emissions in the private sector. And as the emissions in the public sector have grown from 30 to 40%, actually institutional investors, which is the dark blue, their emissions have remained constant. Their proportion of global emissions has remained constant at around 9%. And this is even as they have increased their share of market cap in the equity markets from 40 to 53. So it does seem that investors in general, institutional investors, are decarbonizing on average. This is the slide of how our investor coalitions look. So they have been growing in numbers, and by the end of our sample, the equity AUM of investors who sign up to CDP is actually more than half of the institutional investor pool assets. So they have been quite a big pool of investors. We have 4 portfolio measures that we look at for the investors. They can broadly be classified as internal versus external. On the internal ones, we kind of look at, to the left, the absolute and relative. So one of is the average, how polluting is on average the firm that is in your portfolio. And then as a relative measure, what is the average polluting performance of the firm per dollar of revenue that they generate, how much emissions are they emitting? So this is how polluting the firm is in general versus in relative terms. So this could be used as potentially how exposed is your portfolio to regulation. And then the external measures are how much is the firm's, what you're owning contributing to climate change. So if you own 1% of a firm, we would apportion 1% of the firm's emissions to your portfolio. And then we sum those across different firms. And we say, this is your emissions footprint. This is how much of the emissions in the world you're potentially benefiting from. And we also normalize that by the portfolio size. General, this I'll have to skip in the interest of time, but the first question which we answer is, are investors in general, are the investors who are members of these climate conscious institutions, organizations, are they on average, do they have lower emissions in their portfolios? And perhaps we could say that, but this is only after we also adjust for portfolio characteristics, or not just for investor characteristics. So this would be in some way capturing the investment style. And also in some cases, when we add the investor fixed effects, then we will see that they could be more could have lower emissions in a certain percentage, about 7% lower average emissions and 4.2% lower intensive emissions. So those are on the internal measures that they have those. And we do this also for scope 2 and 3, mixed results there. We look at disclosure. Well, CDP is a disclosure initiative, so it does make sense that there's high disclosure among their portfolio firms. But what we're more interested in is are they decarbonizing over time and how are they doing this? So first, looking at changes in the emissions over yearly changes of the logs, which we can interpret as percentage changes. We see that yes, indeed, these CDP investors are decarbonizing across their relative emissions. So over time, they're invested in less intensive emission firms. And also their overall footprint is decarbonizing more. And this is important. This is relative to the average investor. So the climate conscious CDP investor relative to the average investor. These changes that we're noticing are again within scope 1, and we don't really see an effect within the broader scope 2 and 3 emissions. So after that, then we're saying, how are they achieving this decarbonization? And we think there's 2 major ways. One could be tilting and the other one could be engagement. So we have plotted here the emissions that are owned by institutional investors using our footprint measure within the top 100 emitting firms each year, because those are the ones which are contributing the most to the emissions in general. We then split them into quintiles, and we try and illustrate the 2 ways in which this could be happening. By tilting, over time, the institutional investors would just be dropping the worst polluting firms and allocating more to greener firms. And then via engagement, they will try and improve all of the firms that they own, so that all of the firms are gradually getting better with the emissions footprint. Now, looking at this as a formula, just to break it down, we're trying to decompose the total change. In the total change of yearly emissions, we have your weights are changing. So the red part of the formula, which is you own different firms over time, you own them in different proportions. And then you also have the green part is changing, which means that those firms that you own, they're also over time changing their emissions. So we try and split those into separate changes. In the tilting decomposition, we allow you to own different firms over time, but we keep the emissions constant. So we're trying to see how much of the emissions reduction is because you own different firms over time. And then in the engagement hypothesis, we're trying to see if we force the portfolio to hold the same firms as before, but we allow those firms' emissions to change. How would your emissions have changed? So are the firms that you owned before, have they improved over time? Of course, this would work if the engagement was successful, not if you tried to engage, but it didn't work. But that's how we split them. And what we find is on top is the tilting change. And there we find significant results across most of our measures. So versus in engagement, we don't really find any change for the total changes. So this leads us to conclude that it seems to be that investors, although they're decarbonizing, they're doing it primarily via tilting, which is moving away from the worst performance versus via engagement. And then we also wanted to see if there's a difference with European investors, because they're living in an environment where there has been an emissions trading system over a whole analysis period. Of course, this has been changed in different periods, but it could be something which is salient in investor minds. And we do see that this tilting seems to be quite concentrated, in particular into European investors. And if anything, on the engagement, they're actually going the opposite way. The firms they own are getting worse. So they might be potentially engagement, but not by non-European investors. But European investors seem to be mostly tilting and not really engaging. We also try and test a bit of a theory about potential outsourcing, because other papers such as Daiduan, Liang, and Engie, they have found that some firms are kind of outsourcing their emissions. And we try and see, could we see something similar perhaps portfolios? So this table right now is in the appendix, but we are thinking of perhaps promoting it, because we do find if we look at the changes of the scope 1 to 1 plus 2 plus 3 of the emissions of a portfolio, that over time via tilting, they seem to be allocating more towards firms where the scope 1 of their emissions is lower compared to the full emissions profile of those firms. So perhaps that could also give some evidence of that. But then we also started thinking, perhaps engagement is a bit more difficult to achieve. It might take more time. So let's look at particular situations where it's more likely we would find it. So first, we recalculated all our emissions measures just for the 100 worst emitting firms in overall. And then we looked at how investor portfolios are changing. And we do find here for climate conscious investors some evidence of engagement across most measures except the intensity emissions, but quite importantly, across the footprint, that the footprint coming from the 100 worst firms is getting reduced, and also by engagement, so not just by tilting. Then we thought, well, actually, tilting is very quick to execute. You could just do it in a matter of days, maybe weeks, but engagement might take a lot more for firms to change business processes. So we looked there at the 3-year changes instead of 1-year changes in emissions. And again, here we do find some evidence of engagement over the longer term by climate conscious investors across the footprint measures, which are the external measures, which measure your impact on the world in some ways. And finally, we were able to also add the Climate Action 100 Plus, which is the organization which specific aim is to engage. It was formed after the Paris Agreement, when investors were kind of more committed to do these types of engagement initiatives. And we split investors into only CDP, only Climate Action 100, and both, because a large part of Climate Action 100 investors, they're also CDP investors. And again, in that situation, we do find some evidence of engagement, but that is by the group which are only subscribed to Climate Action 100 relative to other investors. Then this concludes the emissions. As a final kind of work we wanted to see, are also investors, are they looking at other measures which could help achieve the green transition? We looked at 2 measures so far, green revenues and green patents. Green revenues, we use FTSE Russell data. It covers a lot of stocks, over 16,000, but it only starts in 2017. So we only have like 3 years of this data. So it's a bit of a short period. We also look at green patents. So we'll use the UVA Darden global patent database. We combine it with the green OECD environmental mapping by Hasic and Migoto, which has been also used in other papers, Cohen et al., Hegel et al. We look at granted patents, and because there's a tail between when you submit and when the patent is granted, we only finish the period into 2012 to avoid data issues from that particular aspect of the data. And we then look in terms of levels and also changes. What are investors doing, in terms of the weighted average green patents and green revenues in their portfolios. For green patents, they don't have portfolios which on average have more green patents. They're not changing over time. If anything, they're perhaps moving towards companies with worse patent profile. This kind of also echoes the Cohen et al. Paper where the worst emitting firms had also the most green patents. So it could be that. In terms of green revenues, we find better profile is changing, improving over time, but it's by tilting. So again, they seem to be moving towards firms with better green green revenue profile as opposed to changing firms. Thanks, almost there. Then we also do it at the 3-year profile. And for green patents, we don't see anything at 3-year changes. From green revenues, again, we see that there's an improvement in portfolios. They're more exposed to green patents, but that seems to be happening via tilting, not via engagement. So as a conclusion, we kind of say, yes, institutions are decarbonizing their equity portfolios in our analysis period. Our analysis mostly suggests that it seems to be happening via tilting. That's the predominant strategies used by CDP signatories, especially by European CDP signatories. But we do find some evidence of engagement, successful engagement, which is among the holdings of those investors who are with the top emitting firms, the worst performance over longer time periods, 3 years versus 1, and following the Paris Agreement via Climate Action 100+ via that initiative. And because we fail to find evidence, unfortunately, that investors see companies which are developing green technologies or generating a significant fraction of revenues from green products. So they're not improving those companies, but perhaps they're tilting towards them. And given our finding that tilting seems to be the predominant strategies, we kind of cast doubt on the effectiveness of investors to reduce to reduce global emissions if they can, switch towards just firms which have better profiles, as opposed to primarily improve those profiles of the firms. And thank you very much for allowing us to present. I'm looking forward to the discussions and also comments from the audience. Thanks. Cheers.
Thank you so much, and perfect timing. So thank you for doing this great presentation, great piece of research. So we have to discuss one academic, Hao Liang from Singapore Management University. So he's connecting with us probably at the latest time in the day. So thank you so much for doing this, Hao. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. I hope everybody can see my screen now. All right, now it's in full screen. Thanks everyone. My name is Hao Liang. I'm from Singapore Management University. It's 10:20 p.m. here. So if I say something wrong, forgive me. A quick summary of this paper. I think the authors combine some interesting database on firm level carbon emission and institutional ownership data to study whether and how institutional investors around the world reduce their carbon footprints of their portfolios. They identify climate conscious investors who are members of Carbon Disclosure Project or Climate Action 100+. Those investors hold portfolios with lower carbon footprints. So this is decarbonization. And those investors predominantly use the portfolio tilting strategy, meaning they overweight stocks of low carbon companies in their portfolio compared to a so-called engaging strategy that actively force the firms to reduce their carbon emission to improve their environmental profiles. They find limited evidence on measures of energy transition using green innovation and green revenues. So the key message from the paper is that the authors cast doubt on the effectiveness of investor-led initiatives in reducing corporate carbon emissions and combating climate change. I think this is clearly an important topic and with a very strong policy implication. So my comments will be, since I'm an academic discussant, will be around better understanding the investors' incentives to decarbonize their portfolios and distinguishing between greenwashing or carbon outsourcing and the true decarbonization. So my first comments is related to what does the CDP membership really mean? So in the paper, CDP or Climate Action 100+ members are labeled as climate conscious investors. However, from an academic perspective, being a member of the CDP suffers from these endogeneity issues. It's clearly an endogenous choice. For example, those firms may have large market cap. They may be included in major equity indices. They are from certain countries with the norm that make them to join this investor coalition. And when I look at the table, this is the main results. I see flipping signs when you change the control variables and fixed effects. So I think this is an indication that there is clearly some selection going on. So that's why, when you look at the first few coefficients, without that many controls, you have a positive effect. And when you add more controls, or when you put in investor fixed effects, you have a negative coefficient. So this makes me wonder, how much of the results are actually driven by selection. And also, I find some other strange results. For example, if I look at portfolio size, I look at the first three columns, especially column 2 and column 3. I believe that is what the authors try to emphasize. Larger portfolio size, lower carbon emission seems to be a bit counterintuitive. And if I look at Europe and North America, although the authors try to argue that investors from European economies tend to more heavily decarbonize, but the main effects from the first two columns seem to indicate that they actually have a greater carbon footprint in their portfolio. So with all this, I'm wondering, to what extent we can better ascertain the causality. So whether CDP membership leads to greater portfolio decarbonization, or whether more climate conscious investors, they are more likely to join the club. Although this is, a classical academic debate, but I think, understanding the causality in this case will have very strong policy implications. Also, I have doubts on whether, CDP or Climate Action 100+ members are really climate conscious investors. There is increasing concern on greenwashing by investors through endorsing those sustainability coalitions or initiatives, such as UNPRI. So I have a paper, we look at hedge funds, and your other co-authors, Simon, Philip, and Pedro, also have a paper, looking at mutual funds globally. And we all find evidence that investors, although some of them endorse UNPRI, but when you look at their portfolios, they are not really doing the green stuff. They are instead more likely to greenwash. In fact, if I look at your summary statistics, it seems to be the case that investors, they do join CDP, but the CDP members, they seem to have actually higher level of carbon footprints in their portfolios compared to non-CDP members. Of course, it has some change in carbon footprints, but if we simply look at the level, I see some greenwashing going on. And given my previous discussion about region and portfolio size and some counterintuitive results, I feel the negative CDP Scope 1 relation may capture the effects of size or where the investors are located, or maybe there could be other confounding factors. So my suggestions regarding this comment would be to dig deeper into the difference in the level of emissions between CDP and non-CDP investors, and reconcile the findings across different specifications, especially those with flipping signs of the coefficients, and probably needs clear identification to infer causality between CDP membership and portfolio decarbonization. For example, are you able to identify some exogenous shocks to force some investors, but not others, to join the CDP? And you can also consider greenwashing as an alternative explanation. My second comment is related, but this is since you mentioned about my paper, so I want to bring it up more prominently, which is about carbon outsourcing. So I think in majority of the tests, you focus on Scope 1, but in my opinion, testing Scope 1 of portfolio companies does not really tell us much about the true motivation and the effectiveness of investors' decarbonization effort. So clearly, as you mentioned, there is emission outsourcing. They reduce their own emission, but when you see their scope 3 emissions is actually increasing. So suppliers and customers, they bear more of the emission duties. And of course, you also talk about double counting, which is a severe concern, especially when you look at portfolio level, because if some companies are other companies' suppliers or customers, and they are held by the same investor, then clearly there will be double counting concern. My scope 3 may be somewhere else, scope 1. And there is indeed increasing evidence that companies are playing this whack-a-mole game. So they, although investors divest firms with greater carbon footprint, but someone else will pick them up. So you make them the other people's problem. And this may potentially lead to more emissions in aggregate. And when I look at the results using scope 2 and scope 3, I see very weak evidence of decarbonization. So actually only in column 9, you have a very marginal effect. And for the other columns, I think the columns are highlighted, other ones that you try to focus in the paper, there is basically no effect. So this seems to indicate that the overall emission is not really reduced. And this graph also is from New York Times, also shows that if you look at the aggregate emissions by UK companies, if you don't count imports, it seems to decrease over time. But if you take into account of the outsourced part, actually it increases over time. So my suggestion would be to use the overall emissions, so scope 1, 2, 3 combined together to measure portfolio decarbonization throughout your analysis, and also consider carbon outsourcing and how that may affect the interpretation of your results. And I have another two comments. One is about the decarbonization strategy that you focus on, which is tilting versus engaging, or I can reframe this as exiting versus voicing. So which strategy to use depends on the mandate and the investment horizon of the institutional investors. For example, exchange traded funds, they cannot easily exit because they trace the market index. Therefore, they have to rely more on engagement. But on the other hand, they have to spend the resources which may be against their investment mandates and fiduciary duties. Some other investors, they use divestment strategy quite frequently, such as the Norwegian oil fund. Also, tilting and engagement may not be mutually exclusive. Some investors are actively using both. So my suggestions would be, first, we probably need to better understand the nature of the institutional investors and conduct analysis across different investor types, and also consider how to disentangle tilting and engaging for the same investor. Maybe you can examine the change in portfolio composition and individual firms' carbon emission over long term at the same time. And very quickly on my last slide, why are institutional investors incentivized to decarbonize their portfolio? I can think about the following 3 reasons. It's a clientele effect, so they need to satisfy their own investors' demands, especially non-pecuniary demands, or decarbonizing their portfolio simply enhance their financial return. So this is the doing well by doing good argument, or this may simply be an agency problem, such as greenwashing, to camouflage their bad financial performance. All of them would predict a greater fund inflows, and most of the mutual fund managers, they are indeed incentivized to attract fund flows and grow their asset under management. But they have different implications on investor and social welfares. Therefore, I think it's important to disentangle them based on other dimensions. For example, you can test the relation between portfolio carbon footprints and change in the fund financial returns, return flow sensitivity, and maybe also change in funds management incentives such as Delta and Vega. So thanks very much. I enjoy reading the paper, and I will stop here. Hopefully my comments are useful for the authors to move forward.
Thank you so much. So we have the Rosie Farr from PRI.
Yes, hi there.
Go ahead. I don't know if you have slides or you can just start.
Yeah, no slides from me, but yeah, thank you to everyone who's spoken so far. Thank you, Vasca, and your colleagues for sharing the paper, and Hal for your thoughts as well. I'm Rosie Farr. I work on with Carly and the stewardship team. I'm a stewardship specialist at the PRI. I actually work primarily on the Climate Action 100+ initiative that has been mentioned in the paper so far. So that really entails coordinating the engagements with focus companies and specific focus company engagements, sector strategy engagements more broadly, but really deep in the workings of the initiative. So fantastic to read your paper and offer some reflections today. Yeah, so as I said, just to sort of frame my thoughts, I suppose, I think I have sort of quite a practical insight into the paper. I found it very interesting. As I said, I spend a lot of my time focused on the sort of the nuances of investor engagement. And so to sort of take the step back and look at the investor impact overall, the sort of aggregate impact of engagement efforts on a portfolio is certainly a useful framing for me. I think just to start, I wanted to consider this sort of overall, one of the sort of key overall conclusions that investors decarbonize their portfolios mostly via tilting. And I think really for me that that sort of raises two key questions, or sort of the two dimensions to that. Is this sort of issue with the extent of the engagement or with the quality of engagement, in contributing, in the sort of lack of contribution to sort of real decarbonization in portfolios. What I suppose, where in practical terms is the issue there? So I think, yeah, as I said, around the sort of extent of engagement, I think for me that sparks questions around the current role of engagement. And I think Hao touched on that in some of his final comments about the reasons why this might be an underutilized tool compared to other investment, sort of more established investment practice strategies. We're currently undertaking some work within PRI related to stewardship resourcing and what might be obstacles and what might be sort of, I guess, how tackling an issue of stewardship, a lack of stewardship resourcing might contribute to better sustainability outcomes. I guess as well, in general, I think for me, I find it very interesting to sort of quantify. For me, I see this sort of trade-off in the looking at the sort of real emissions reductions and this sort of real contribution to portfolio decarbonization versus the specifics of engagement conversations. And so that's something I'll come to in just a second. But just to my point before previously around the sort of extent of engagement versus quality of engagement, I think my second key takeaway, I suppose, is as well is that this sort of reinforces the research, at least the way I see it, reinforces the need, the necessity for really sort of effective outcomes focused stewardship. I think, again, this is something we work really closely with. We dive a lot into in all of our work through C100+, but through the stewardship team more broadly, is the sort of real economy outcomes. We, through engagements in CA100+, we're not sort of just, we're not seeking, say, disinvestment just from highly polluting assets. We sort of really promote sort of reorientation of the entire business strategy towards a low emissions model. So I think, yeah, that's the sort of two overarching comments from me on the overall conclusion. I think one of the to just get into a bit more of the specifics, I think one of the problems, or sort of one of the areas that I think the paper really nicely identifies is it sort of speaks to the problems of quantifying the impact of investor engagement. We, often through my work in CA100+ and more broadly, we often have this sort of difficult process of untangling the impact of investor engagement from other investor strategies. So I think, the way that the sort of insights this paper offers is certainly useful. I think one sort of, I suppose, question from myself, I think, again, the paper does touch on it, but is this idea that, engaging with firms can be such an involved process, taking many years to deliver tangible results. And so I think some of the sort of backward-looking data on emissions, I think this is kind of the trade-off that I'm trying to understand of. Obviously, I'm well aware that sort of ultimately the real emissions reductions is all that matters, but I'm not sure that it the data that we're seeing necessarily conveys the complexity of conversations within the engagements. You know, I think one of the conclusions I was just looking at is that this, you know, fails to find evidence that climate conscious investors seek out companies generating a significant fraction of their revenues from green products or services. And at least from the sort of the conversation, thank you, sorry, at least from the conversations that I'm involved in, I think, you know, again, it's sort of, that is certainly a sort of strong engagement topic. And so whilst that might not be sort of reflected in the sort of capital alignment of portfolios, I think that it doesn't necessarily quite capture the sort of nuance of conversation there. I wanted to just touch briefly as well on the definition of climate conscious investors. Again, I think this is, I don't want to repeat Hao's comments. So I'll just sort of add my thoughts. I think kind of similar to the point I was speaking to before. I think I suppose the defining of climate conscious investors, I think I would like to see a sort of more sort of accurate reflection of, I'm not sure accurate is the right word, but there's a sort of fundamental difference between the requests of CDP and CA100 plus, I think. And I think it would benefit, perhaps I would like to see more research moving forwards on sort of other investor climate initiatives that have a more an even sort of stronger focus. I would say that the sort of CDP group, I suppose, of climate conscious investors, I wouldn't necessarily as homogeneously across the board sorry, I'm mixing up my words. Have I finished on time?
We are on time, yes.
Okay, sorry. Can I just 30 seconds just on sort of implications moving forward? I think the work really has some really important sort of focus, both for CA100 plus and PRI more broadly moving forward. I think in the CA100 plus engagements, I think it really sort of reinforces our role in refocusing on real emissions reductions, establishing engagement strategies and sort of supporting our role in enabling investors to drive real economy emissions reductions, utilizing the sort of full variety of stewardship tools at their disposal. I think it raises questions around what sort of more broadly what we should focus on investors' portfolio decarbonization as well as their specific engagement efforts. And then I think obviously, as I touched on these other elements of PRI's work moving forward, around sort of resourcing to stewardship and outcomes focused stewardship. But thank you very much. I'm sorry for running over on time there.
No problem. Thank you very much. And maybe there was an interesting discussion online as well, which in some ways has been already addressed, but how also raised the issue of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So maybe Vasca, if you can also address that in your reply, as again, there's been some discussion already.
Yeah. So the scope 1, 2 plus 3, it's a question that we're also grappling with a lot, because ideally we wanted to focus on the emissions that are completely within the control of the firms, those that they would be able to easily reduce. But of course, we are aware the scope 3 emissions are like the large majority of emissions. The problem we've had there is the double counting, that they could be someone else's scope 1 plus 2. And another one is also the source of the data, because among different data providers, scope 1 and 2 emissions tend to be quite consistent and very heavily correlated by provider. But scope 3 emissions, they often have low correlations. So it's more difficult to be certain that they've been also accurately measured, because everyone is to a certain extent estimating the scope 3 emissions. But we do agree that we need to look more on the breakdown of those emissions, and especially, as Hao said, on the outsourcing element, because that has been a very interesting result that we also kind of confirming stuff that he has looked at, but at the investor level, that even investors perhaps are looking for those firms. And what would be the implications of this outsourcing, even at the investor level, for overall emissions levels? that was one of the things. And also, like, I agree with you how about the selection methods. At the moment, we're not claiming causality. Obviously, we're looking at ways to make it a bit more exogenous and to be able to have like stronger claims. In terms of the levels, yeah, the level results, because the CDP investors, they tend to be larger, which kind of has contributed to them. Before we account for their characteristics, they do look worse on the emissions profile, which is why you have to add a lot of other fixed effects. And as they join, they become a bit better on the measures. But as we have this finding that they start worse, but they seem to be improving more, which is where we're looking at the changes a lot more. Even though they start worse, they seem to be improving faster than other investors. And it's, do you give them credit for improving faster, or do you think, but you know, they kind of start a bit worse to begin with? And on the European investors being worse, yet that is true. That's why we kind of, when we look at the CDP, we say, if you're both CDP and European, then how do things change? Because just being European does not seem to be like enough of a change. I really liked your comments about looking more at the incentives, like perhaps if we could split investors by incentives a bit more. That could work quite interesting, because we try to look at, you know, investment manager versus asset manager, but the way the data is in fact set, almost everyone is an investor manager. So we don't really have that many assets which are directly managed by asset managers, as most of that has been like shifted to investor managers. But it is interesting to look at that also, the passive versus active. That is something we're definitely looking at, like we should be looking at more. And yeah, the incentives, average emissions. And Rosie, also, thank you so much. Like someone who actually working with Climate Action 100, it was great to have your comment and how like the conversations that are actually happening within the room. We are looking to try and get closer to this engagement channel, because at the moment we're kind of measuring if the engagement has been successful and there's actually results in the emissions. But we do want to make sure that this is, you know, what we're measuring, and to try and get closer with more evidence perhaps of what the shareholders are doing, either at meetings, like either at shareholder proposals or these internal meetings, if you can get more data on that channel, because that would be quite, you know, that would make that channel more easy to track down, versus tilting where you could directly observe if you're actually switching. Engagement is more involved, as you said, and it's a bit harder to pinpoint it. That's super, but we are trying to like get more into that detail and find it. And Fabrizio, should I also look at the comments in the chat now, or did you want to? Yeah, let's start with.
Again, I think many were about scope 1 versus scope 2. Maybe there was so I guess Ken Packer, I don't know if he's still connected, was also, I guess, raising the issue. Well, at the end of the day, you know, it's something that you have in the paper. So I don't know, Ken, are you there, or do you want to raise the question, or? So at the end of the day, you know, what is the then total amount of emissions? Because you do start a paper by acknowledging that this is not the case.
I'm here, but I'm in an airport, so I'll just let you answer the question.
Cool. Let's make quite the quick, because investors are chosen towards emission. Yeah, so that's one of the things we're saying, that a lot of investor attention has been, you know, on these initiatives and trying to reduce emissions. But yeah, if they are tilting, what is the effect? And also you might end up with owners which are not even in the public markets, right? Because as we saw, although the capitalization that you own more of the equity markets as an institutional investor, even before we start looking at CDP and climate action, even before we do that, all investors, although they own more of the capital markets, they own less of these polluting firms. So that's something very important, like for our research, maybe future work, and also to look at where is it going. Private markets is one of them, but also within the public markets, you also have the minority, you have the closely held shares. So there are other investors which perhaps have less pressure even than the public investors. And that is, something we're thinking about a lot. How should we look at that? How should we address? Is this something that we should be like discussing also potentially with institutional investors, as they think they're doing the right thing, but you know, it might have these unintended consequences.
Thank you. And in fact, you do start by saying, you know, that between 2005 and 2019, the direct carbon emission of public listed firm went from 30% to 41% of the global CO2 equivalent. So overall, again, there is a growing emission, but the share print of the institutional investor is lower. But thank you so much.
I find that very fascinating. Thank you. And I will look through the comments as we
and we can get back to this perhaps in the final Q&A and discussion. And we'll continue with a paper that is actually very much in line with the discussion that we've had so far. So a paper co-authored by Alex Edman from LBS, Doron Levitt, and Jan Schneemeyer from Indiana University. So Doron will present the paper. Thank you so much.
Okay, hello everyone. Let me just share my screen. Very good. Can you all see my slides? Okay, very good. So thank you very much for including the paper in this conference. It's really a pleasure to be here, see some familiar faces. We're still doing it partly with Zoom, which I guess has its advantages. But let me jump right into this topic. So the paper is called Socially Responsible Divestment. And so let me kind of take a step back and just kind of set up the stage for this paper. As you all know by now, I think, responsible investing is simply the practice of incorporating some ESG factors into investment decision, and that has become increasingly common. Now, broadly speaking, there are two main channels for which this is practiced. One is engagement, voting, discussions with management, trying to influence directly policies of firms. And the second one is divestment. And the idea is simply selling companies that exert negative externalities. And within this set of strategies, we can distinguish between two, exclusion and tilting, which is going to be the focus of this paper. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about each of those. So what is exclusion? How do we define it? It's basically a blanket divestment of industries that the investor deems as irresponsible. And you can see here in the slides, there is a few examples for which industries are typically classified as irresponsible: fossil fuel, tobacco, etc. And what is the rationale behind the exclusion? Basically to starve these sectors of capital, and hopefully that those companies will die slowly, and therefore there will be fewer externalities. And as you can see from these graphs, exclusion is basically become very, very common, at least in measured by the number of institutions that made some commitment to divest fossil fuel, or by the amount of AUM that has made that commitment. So definitely it's a very important phenomena worthwhile studying. Now, asset managers seems to be excluding companies, brown firms, to maximize their portfolio's average ESG ratings. And essentially, they are pressured to do that by different stakeholders, different constituencies. It could be the asset owners themselves who have expectation for a net zero portfolios, by rating providers who basically look at the average rating and some evidence suggesting this is affecting inflows or outflows, and even by academics who study those funds. They look at their average ESG rating. Now, is exclusion effective? Perhaps there are a few reasons to believe that it's not as effective as people might think. First, it may not deprive a company of capital, right? And investors can only sell if someone else buys. Also, exclusion doesn't defund the company immediately, only makes it harder to sell shares in the future. And finally, brown companies in many industries, many examples we have, aren't raising much capital to begin with. Why? Because they are kind of yesterday's industries with very little growth opportunities. But this is not to say, and empirically, by the way, some evidence suggesting that indeed it's ineffective. But to emphasize, this does not mean that exclusion or the investment per se is ineffective. There could be some other channels than the cost of capital. For example, a low stock price can worsen the CEO reputation, increase the risk of being fired, and lowers the value of their equity stakes. Which basically brings me to the second strategy, the investment strategy, which is tilting, basically leaning away from a brown sector, holding only the industry ESG leader, basically the best asset, best in class asset. So what is the rationale? The rationale here, and that's going to be the focus of this paper, is that brown companies, like fossil fuel companies, they can take some corrective action to minimize the harm that they create. Fossil fuel companies can actually develop some renewable energies, and there is evidence that they are in fact doing that. Now, trading in general could lead to stock price reflecting managers' action in taking those corrective steps. Therefore, might lead to rewarding managers that are taking corrective actions and punishing those that don't. So there might be some benefit, a real benefit to tilting. But of course, this might lead to low ESG ratings because those asset managers will hold brown firms in their portfolios and maybe even for greenwashing acquisitions. Okay, so overall, there is a question, which divestment strategy is more effective, exclusion versus tilting? And that's actually what we do in this paper. We develop a theoretical framework to study the trade-offs between the exclusion and tilting as responsible divestment strategies. Okay, so we are going to have a model with some key ingredients. So we are going to think about a brown firm that emits externalities. We are going to have a profit-motivated manager. So the firm will have the objective of maximizing its profit. Of course, there are some interesting discussion about how we can change the governance of firms. So even the firms themselves might pursue different objectives. But for now, we are focusing on profit-motivated managers. The key innovation, the key aspect of the paper is that the managers can take some non-contractable corrective action to reduce those externalities. I will talk more about it. We're going to have primary and secondary stock markets and socially responsible block holders, large investors whose motivation is to reduce the externalities. And we're going to focus on two strategies, exclusions and tilting. Okay, so I will not go into the math behind this model, but I would like to explain in slightly more details what is the analytical framework that we are exploring here, and then I will go to the result and intuitions. Okay, so initially we have the block holder, which basically announce or commits to a certain divestment strategy. Broadly speaking, there are two options: either exclusion, never invest in the brown company, or tilting, invest if and only if a corrective action is taken. Now, commitment is going to be important, and you can think of the commitment coming from the fact that if you state a certain strategy and you deviate from that, that could lead to withdrawals by your investors or even to some regulatory intervention. And what is the objective of the block orders is to minimize externalities. We have an extension where the investors are trading off some trading profits with these externalities. Actually, there are some interesting insight there. Hopefully, I'll get to. Okay, so after the block orders announce the divestment strategies, managers can take corrective actions. Managers are maximizing some weighted average of the long-term firm value and the short-term stock price, so they might have some short-term considerations. Importantly, the managers needs incentives in order to take the corrective actions because they don't have any social motives to do that, so it has to be in their best interest from a profit maximizing perspective. And a corrective action has cost the firm, so the firm has to devote some resources in order to reduce externalities. But again, the benefit from a social perspective, there will be fewer externalities. The action is observable by the block holders. The block holders have some information about actions taken by the firm, but it's not contractable. It's hard to specify exactly the nature of technology that will be developed. For example, think about oil company developing some renewable energy technology, which hard to state in a contract. Okay, so manager decides whether to take these corrective actions, and then basically firms is going to issue some shares to finance investment, expansion of the firm. This type of investment in general is positive NPV, it's creating some shareholder value, but ultimately would increase externalities. This is a brown firm. So oil energy company is going, then it will actually produce more externalities. And then we have some competitive markets for those shares where everyone can trade. The share price and therefore the cost of capital will be determined, and also the fundraisings for the expansions of the firm. Importantly, if the block orders is going to demand more share, that's going to have some price impact resulting with a higher share price. Okay. And finally, we are going to have some cash flow generation and externalities. Okay, so this is the framework, and of course, then in the paper we spent some time solving the model. Let me get into kind of some of the intuitions of what we have. So let's start with exclusion. What does exclusion do in the model? Well, under exclusion strategy, the block orders always sells, no matter what the manager is doing. If the block orders sells, we're going to have a lower share price, that is a higher cost of capital, which means that it will be more costly for the firm to raise funds. There's going to be a smaller expansion, ultimately resulting with lower externalities. So that's kind of the typical common wisdom behind the benefit of exclusion, how to starve firm from capital. But at the same time, because the block orders sells no matter what, managers who are profit motivated have no reason to take the corrective action, which demands some resources from the firm, comes at the expense of shareholder value. So the corrective action will not be taken. And without the corrective actions, well, externalities would be higher. So in our framework, even though we shut down the engagement channel completely, not to say that it has no relevance, yet exclusion might still discourage a company from becoming green and more socially responsible. Okay, so this is exclusion. What about tilting? Well, under the tilting strategy, the block orders buys shares of the brown firm if and only if a corrective action is taken. So, well, if the block orders is buying shares, that implies we're going to have a higher share price, lower cost of capital. And by the same logic as before, but now reversed, we're going to have a larger expansion because it's cheaper for the company to raise funds. And therefore, we're going to have higher externalities. Why? Because after all, this is a brown company. It by nature, it's producing externalities. But because the managers understands that the block orders will buy shares if and only if the corrective action is taken, and as a consequence, the share price will increase, then the manager has incentive to take the corrective action. And that can offset the externalities emitted by the firm. So we have a trade-off here, okay? Another way to present this trade-off is that under exclusion, the cost of capital is higher and therefore the firm expansion is lower. Under tilting, it's the opposite. We have a lower cost of capital and therefore higher expansion, which is bad for the externalities. However, under exclusion, managers have no incentive to take corrective actions. They are being sold no matter what. Under tilting, they do. So another way to think about this trade-off, this key trade-off between exclusion and tilting is in a contracting setting. So exclusion can be thought as basically paying a manager a flat salary, which might be cheaper, but it provides no incentive to take the correct action. Whereas tilting incentivizes the action, but requires perhaps a more expensive pay for performance. Okay, so taking this trade-off in the paper, we basically analyze this trade-off and we show that tilting can be more effective than exclusion. Responsible investors should not divest in entire sectors, but rather hold best asset in class or use industry-adjusted ESG measures. We show that in the trade-off between tilting and exclusion, tilting should be used when corrective actions are cost effective. So for example, in industries like fossil fuel, which some renewable energy can be developed, you should do tilting. Maybe in other industries like controversial weapons, there is basically no corrective action, or they are very ineffective in those contexts. We also show that managers' stock price concerns are high. Tilting is more likely to be effective because this is where providing incentives is relatively cheap. And this has some, we think, some takeaways for regulators and policymakers. You should not automatically punish funds that hold brown stocks if they tilt. And we should probably not use the average holding of green stocks as a measure of an investor's sustainability or social responsibility. In fact, we would argue perhaps we should scrutinize actively managed sustainable funds that in fact engage in blanket exclusion. You can treat them a little bit like closet indexers. Maybe they're charging higher fees, but don't provide the more sophisticated, perhaps, divestment strategy. Okay, we have several extensions which we think are kind of very relevant from a policy perspective. So let me go briefly mention a few of them. So what if corrective action taken by firms is unobservable, only partially informative signal is? For example, think about ESG rating being the signal that the block holders obtain. Well, we show in the paper tilting will be less effective because we need to give the managers a higher reward for the corrective action. And this kind of highlights a novel benefit of ESG disclosure, which is basically allows investors to induce corrective actions without having to promise large amounts of capital to the firm. Now, related, if managers, profit-motivated managers, can increase ESG disclosures, we show that they will do it only if the investors has option to tilt. Why? Well, in order to boost the stock price by attracting those tilting investors. So as a takeaway for regulators, one way to improve, indirect way to improve ESG disclosures is to deter funds that only exclude or encourage funds to engage in tilting. That will incentivize managers to disclose which ESG related information, which in turn will reinforce the tilting strategy. In many instances, we know that asset managers, at least some of them, claim that they do their own due diligence and gather information about the corrective actions. That can actually be beneficial because it allows them to link investments to action rather than some imperfect, noisy information. So tilting will be more effective if investors will have more information. However, the problem with that is that investors might end up investing in brown companies based on their due diligence, based on their private information. But in the eyes of the public, they're simply investing in firms that might seem unreformed. And if those investors are concerned about being accused for greenwashing, they will just not gather information and overall will be less effective as social responsible investors. So as a takeaway for regulators, we should combat the risk that buying brown stocks is necessarily seen as greenwashing. In fact, not buying brown stock that has reformed should be considered as greenwashing in many ways.
3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, very good. I'm about to finish. So finally, we do two robustness extensions, which we think are very relevant. A common criticism, one is about arbitrageurs or having hedge funds involved in financial markets. Well, a common criticism of divestment is that hedge funds can buy brown stocks at depressed prices, basically offsetting or reversing the impact of divestments. So we analyzed that in the model. And as one might expect, indeed, both tilting and exclusions are less effective when you have those arbitrageurs who are picking up those shares. However, what we show is that the presence of arbitrageurs makes the tilting relatively more effective than exclusion. Essentially, tilting is more robust to those arbitrageurs. Intuition being is that exclusion involves selling more of the firm shares and therefore is more sensitive to the existence of arbitrageurs. Finally, of course, in practice, many of those responsible investors also have a mandate to a fiduciary duty to generate financial returns for their investors. So we extend the model analyzing a profit-motivated responsible investor. And one of the things that we show is that they have stronger incentive to tilt and induce the corrective action relative to investors who are only motivated by reducing externalities. Intuition being is that tilting involves buying some brown companies, brown firms, so there are some gains from trade, gains from diversification, gains from risk sharing that those investors now internalize. What we show is that this profit motivation, in fact, can substitute for a commitment or a need for a commitment in order to tilt and buy brown companies. So again, is another takeaway for policymakers is that, well, ensuring funds fulfill their fiduciary duty to generate financial return is not inconsistent with achieving social goals. In fact, we show sometimes it actually moves you in the right directions because it substitutes for the need for a commitment. Okay, so just to summarize, we analyze in this paper the optimal divestment strategy. We look at the trade-off between tilting and exclusion. We show that tilting can be more effective than exclusion as a divestment strategy. The cost of capital channel may be weak, might be dominated, and firm can be incentivized to take some real corrective action to reduce their externalities through the tilting channel. Responsible investors should not divest in entire sectors, but rather hold the best asset in class and use perhaps industry-adjusted ESG measures. And similarly, the rating of asset managers should not be based solely on their portfolio holding, but perhaps about, whether they hold performed companies in their portfolios. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doron. Great timing and a great paper. So we do have Lin Shen connected as an academic discussant joining us from INSEAD. Thank you so much for joining us and discussing this paper. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for Brazil. So I would like to first thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. So I'll start my discussion by briefly summarize what the paper does. Oops. Okay. So the paper starts from an observation that there's one very popular ESG investment strategy, which is simply to exclude all the brown assets. So we're doing some negative screenings when we're doing investment. And one typical rationale for this type of investment strategy is that by excluding brown assets when you're investing, you could increase the cost of capitals for these brown firms and then reduce their investments and reduce the negative externalities they're imposing to the society. Okay, so given that, what the paper does is to ask the question, is this simple exclusion strategy an efficient strategy to implement responsible investment? Okay, and one potential problem with this exclusion strategy is that if we think about brown firms, they actually have greater room for improvement compared to green firms. And therefore, ESG investment or responsible investment can potentially generate greater impact by influencing their behaviors. And if this is the case, and this is what we have in mind, then what could be a potentially more efficient alternative? And there, the authors are proposing tilting strategy, which is to reward brown firms for taking the corrective actions by investing in them and giving them cheaper capitals when they're doing the right thing, such that they will have incentive to do the corrective actions, do this right thing at the beginning, okay, in the first place. All right, so going a little bit more into the model. So in this model, there is a brown firm issuing new shares to finance a project. So this project is financially positively, it's generating some financial return, positive return, but this is a brown firm, so it's generating negative social externalities, and both are constant return to scale, so it's proportional to the investment size. And the investment size is determined by the product of the exogenous number of shares that the firm decides to issue at this endogenous issuance price P. Okay, and the firm has this option to take a corrective action, which is publicly observable, and it's costly, so it will reduce the financial return, but it will create some benefit by reducing the negative externalities that this brown firm is producing. Okay, and then the issuance price P is determined by clearing all the demands on the financial market. And there are two types of investors on this financial market. Households are the typical small investors, risk averse, they're chasing profits. While this block holder, what they call block holder, is the responsible investor. In this case, they are large, they have price impact, and they endogenize their price impact. And they're risk neutral, they're trying to minimize the externalities generated by this firm. And in this financial market, short selling is not allowed. So if block holder demands more of the shares, this will push up the issuance price, And when the issuance price P is higher, then the investment size, which is this P times an exogenous fixed number of shares Q, is going to increase. So this firm is able to raise more money and invest more. Okay, and this block holder can commit to a strategy that is contingent on the corrective action. So when this firm does not take any corrective action, it's always optimal to for this block holder to invest zero, because by investing, you only increase the investment size and generating more negative externality. Okay. However, upon corrective action, there are two choices essentially that can be the optimal choice: tilting versus exclusion. And by tilting in this paper, it's basically trying to induce the corrective action with sufficiently large amount of demand for their shares. But tilting is not costless, because here, when you're demanding more shares, this will increase the size of the investment and generating more externalities, because the externalities is proportional to the investment size. However, there's a benefit, which is for each dollar of investment, this corrective action would help reduce the externalities generated per dollar of investment. So in the end, whether tilting or exclusion is the best, is the optimal strategy and optimal action to take, depends on the cost-benefit trade-off. And therefore, the main result is tilting can be optimal when this corrective action is sufficiently cost-effective in this externality reduction. And this cost is not only the financial cost, but also related to how costly you are to incentivize this firm manager to take this corrective action. Okay, while exclusion is optimal otherwise. And they consider a bunch of extensions with very rich results, but due to the time limits, I don't think I will have time to go through each one of them. But just briefly speaking, so extension 1 is about considering imperfect information about corrective action. So this corrective action is no longer perfectly publicly observable. Then when we have this noisy signal about corrective action and the investment strategy conditional on this noisy signal, then this would increase the cost of motivating corrective action, and tilting will become less efficient. So you would want more accurate public signal to implement this tilting strategy. And then the second extension is when we have a profit-motivated responsible investor, then this trading profit can serve as a commitment device. Even though this responsible investor don't have this commitment power, then trading profits can help them to better commit to invest and tilting strategy. Okay, so that's the paper, and here comes my comments. So my first comments is more of an expositional comments, which is essentially in this paper, there are two channels at play at the same time, a primary market channel and a secondary market channel, in the sense that if we look at the manager's objective, they're trying to decide whether to take this corrective action to maximize a weighted average of the issuance price and the ultimate payoff cash flow generated by this firm. So the primary market channel refers to if the block holder invests in this firm and boost up the stock price, then that will increase the investment size and therefore increase the firm value, the cash flow generated by this investment. That's the primary market channel. Well, there is also a secondary market channel, which is manager directly actually care about the short-term stock price because of something that is unmodeled in this model here. So as long as this omega is positive, there's also the secondary market channel. By having higher price, you could incentivize the manager to, you could reward the manager and induce corrective action. So my question here is one channel sufficient to generate these results? I think the answer would be yes. And here, maybe it could help to streamline the model and clarify the mechanisms by, for example, focusing on the secondary market channel. So as long as omega is positive, even we don't model equity issuance, the block holder can still induce corrective action with tilting as long as the manager care directly about the stock price. Okay, so that's the first comment. And the second comment—
3 minutes.
Yeah, it's about, that's great. So the second comment is about the interpretation of greenwashing. So in this paper, they interpret the greenwashing as a false negative public signal in the sense that when the firm actually takes the corrective action, but the noisy public signal, so this is in one of the extension, so noisy public signal indicate that there's actually no corrective action. If this is the case, while block holder, they acquire private information that the firm indeed, they verify the firm indeed take the corrective action, and they want to reward the firm by implementing this tutoring strategy, then they could face this potential accusation of greenwashing because the public would think that the firm is not taking corrective action. So this reputation concern would deter the block holders' incentive to acquire information and implement this tutoring strategy. So that's the interpretation in the paper. But I think that there can be an alternative interpretation of greenwashing, which is it can be a false positive signal where there could be some moral hazard problem within the firm. The firm takes actually no corrective action. However, it can send out a false positive signal to let the market think that they actually already took the action. And if this is the case and the block holder do not acquire information, just blindly rely on the public signal to invest in the firm and implement this tutoring strategy, this could be proved wrong later on. So in the long run, it could be proved wrong. And in the long run, there might be some reputation concern about lack of due diligence for the block holder. And if this is the case, then the reputation concern could actually encourage information acquisition, because if you don't acquire information, there could be a potential reputation concern in the future. Okay, so it might be worthy to consider this alternative interpretation. And lastly, I think it could be useful to consider some further extensions, like including multiple firms in this model. So currently there is only one firm. If we have multiple firms and suppose that the green capital is limited, then potentially there can be some interesting effects going on. So for example, if all firms are brown, they all generate negative externalities, then there could be potentially a tournament effect for this limited cheap green capital. And it could be more effective in incentivizing different firms to compete with each other in terms of implementing this corrective action. And there could also be some divergence in different firms' strategies. So maybe they are ex ante the same, but because green capital is limited, green capital can only be invested in one of the firms, and that would incentivize the firm to take the corrective action, while the other firm don't. So the firms may be ex ante the same, but they end up on different routes in the end. Well, there could also be cases when some of the firms are green while some of the firms are brown. Then here, there could be a potential opportunity cost to implement this tutoring strategy, because then you would divert some of the capital from green firms, and this would increase the cost of capital for green firms to generate positive externalities. Okay, so just to conclude, I think this is a very convincing and robust story about how to think about efficient, responsible investment strategy, and this paper really have a lot of rich implications, and very interesting paper. I enjoyed reading it. I encourage everyone to read it. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we have Joy Kurtz with us from Wells Fargo and Northwestern. So thank you, Joy, to be with us.
Thanks for having me. Lynn's done such a fantastic job going through the paper and the methodology. I'll lighten up my comments on that. It's okay, we'll share a screen if I may. I'm just going to quickly go through some sort of unstructured text here. First of all, strong paper, fantastic paper, very good theoretical paper, but more importantly, it's an important paper. It's speaking to stuff that we haven't thought enough about, and I think promotes rethinking of our assumptions. And that's where I think theory can be really, really valuable. As a practitioner, we're always what outperforms what factors help me make money. This is thinking about the health of the system and how things should work. There's an implicit critique in the paper, and I think it's a valid critique. They did a really good lit review around the theoretical literature. There's been a lot of recent work after a long drought, frankly. And the point is that these papers, as strong as they are, and some of them are really good, The above papers do not model externalities or the different strategies promoted by responsible investors. But I think this point around externalities is crucial. When we talk about responsible investment as a taste or a preference, we're sort of saying that the investor, the responsible investor, has no information about fundamentals. Well, responsible investors have long argued that externalities have great fundamental significance and that markets often misprice them. And as a practitioner, I believe that my whole career and done okay. But just, I think it follows on to earlier conversations today. Why should capital markets concern themselves with externalities? When you're modeling, you can put in a box and say, well, the regulator handles this, or you can say the government governs. Just two quick provocative quotes and I'll move on. First one is from a 2006 speech from the CEO of Exxon, Lee Raymond. He said, we operate in 10, 20, 30, 4-year cycles. Put that in context, that's 20 US Congresses. A single quarter, single year, which could mean everything from a political circus point of view, is not really all that significant in the time frame we operate in. Really, the only entities I can think of that can match that kind of time frame are the so-called universal owners, the big institutions in Europe, CalPERS here in California, that do have a long time horizon that matches it. Those are the only people who are peers, if you will, to those types of organizations. And many of the externalities we concern ourselves with, tobacco, climate change, these are things that play out over long time periods. In a representative democracy, when you're electing a new government every 2-4 years, it's tough to maintain an attention span. So that implies there's room for another actor. Also, just the simple fact of regulatory capture. This is a quote from the prize, Daniel Yergin, talking about oil production in Libya in the 60s. Someone died and an oil executive told Yergin, we were having real trouble figuring out who to bribe. Okay, so in the real world, yeah, there's plenty of room for capital markets to get involved in the management of externalities. We cannot assume the regulatory channel is going to handle this. More technically, an investor who invests in a firm that imposes significant externalities is betting on policy dysfunction. And that creates a host of systemic risks that investors could collaborate with companies to promote policy dysfunction. And some people might say that they've seen evidence of that. In any case, the taste and preferences approach ignores all this. And this paper is getting it right and looking at investors are concerned about externalities, not just because it's a taste or preference. The remedy, though, may reduce firm value, maybe in the short term, maybe in the long term. So this idea that we're dealing with divestment and with engagement, great framework. For people who want to go deeper into that, Hirschman's book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, correctly anticipated the structure this industry would ultimately take, where you have boycotters and you have engagers like Hermes will outsource its engagement capability or allow other managers to outsource it. One point, though, the Hirschman framework, which pervades our industry, is dualistic. You either engage or you divest. There's no intermediate ground. And Hirschman wrote a simple book and probably did this to clarify things. And in many of the examples he was considering, you really do have a stark choice. The point the authors make here is you have an intermediate strategy that could work very well. It may be optimal, they say, for a responsible investor to pursue a tilting strategy where you tilt away, but you're willing to hold firms that take corrective actions. That's really important because when you exclude, when you divest, you forego voice, you limit the opportunity for impact. My experienced clients want impact. They want their capital to be working toward better solutions and constructive change, not passively, fatalistically avoiding bad things. Another virtue of the paper is reconsidering the cost of capital channel. I just want to say a few words about why a lot of us have been hand-waving it for a long time. A premise of this model is that the investor can take large positions and have price impact. As an active manager, my life, I'm a price taker. The price in the Wall Street Journal is what I pay, and I can't do much about that, even with fairly large pools of capital. Stocks are pretty good substitutes for one another, and responsible investors have been working with multi-factor models so that they can just throw a stock or two out and still get the same group of factor bets in another way. So we've not been overly concerned about the capital channel. I think the South Africa boycott probably was formative in this. Teal Welsham was on, which the authors cite, said there was a long debate about whether the South Africa boycott was moving capital markets. And Teal Welsham was on, did a lot of work and kept getting a null finding. And that implied that markets were big enough and liquid enough to accommodate social investors' taste and preferences without significant impact. But there's good theoretical work. Merton especially, and Angel and Rivoli back in '97 did a simple rehearsal of this that tied it back to Hirschman's book. If you got enough people boycotting, you could move a stock and you could move it below its equilibrium value. And the Merton insight is there might not be enough averse investors to restore equilibrium value. So in the model that we're talking about in the paper, the model conceptualizes an investor, but maybe it's more powerful to think of that as a coalition of investors who do have market power and can change the structure of the market so that there's not enough risk-averse investors willing to come in and restore equilibrium value. So tilting preserves.
2 minutes.
Thanks. Just one more point. I think that point on incentives is critical. Management incentives, the whole management contracting literature, I think ties in very tightly with this. So I think that's appropriate for everyone to consider as they think about this. Final point, I don't think it was addressed here, but there is some empirical work from MSCI that suggests there are also portfolio benefits to tilting rather than excluding. For the Swedish pension fund AP4, they explored the trade-off between carbon exposure and tracking error, and they found that using multi-factor tools, you could get tracking error down much more efficiently per unit of risk than through a simple boycott. So the portfolio manager, apart from the possibility of having a more effective impact mechanism through the cost of capital channel, the portfolio manager has a selfish reason to prefer tilting. They may get a more efficient portfolio by pursuing this strategy as well. So that completes my comments. Happy to participate in the Q&A if anyone has questions on the points I've raised. Thank you.
Thank you. So perhaps, Doron, do you want to reply? Then we have a few questions, but actually, maybe just before we do that, I mean, let me add that just a piece of information that I did not share before, because so the paper that was just presented was the winner of the best paper award for the PRI Academic Week. So perhaps join me in congratulating Doron and his co-authors on this achievement. And thank you for sending the paper and sharing it with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio, and all the organizers, and of course to our two discussants. These are all really wonderful comments and feedback. So perhaps let me very briefly say a few things, and maybe then open it up for Q&A. So let me start with the academic discussion by Lynn. I mean, I agree with all the point in the sense that first, everything works in our analysis, even if managers have no short-term consideration. It's kind of interesting that if they do, right, managers really obsessed with the short-term stock price, that can actually be beneficial from a social perspective because it gives even stronger, it makes tilting more effective. So we wanted to emphasize that, but maybe there is a better way to write it. I think the point about how there could be like a different reputational concerns and how kind of the concern of investing in a company, brown company that end up kind of faking its social responsibility would incentivize information gathering. I think it's a great point. We should definitely think more about it. The only thing I can say is that if if investors have very little information about what firms are doing, or they are concerned about this faking by the firms of their ESG policy, they are likely to choose exclusion because tilting might be less effective. But I think it's definitely a point we should think about. And I totally agree that there is a lot of kind of potentially interesting interactions which are very relevant in the real world that we abstract from, such as having multiple firms and the interaction between them, or even having multiple investors. So all of those things, hopefully we'll be able to incorporate in some future version of it. So thank you very much. Also, thanks Lilith for the great kind of feedback. I think it's excellent. Like thinking about tilting as kind of the middle ground between exit and voice is actually, it's a very nice way to think about it. It has a little bit of both in many ways. So I agree with this. I also think I need to think a little bit more about, can we think about our investors as a coalition of small investors? Again, I guess then there might be some collective action kind of issues. We have to think in coordination. We have to think a little bit more carefully. But some investors are large, and we're talking about like BlackRock, Vanguard, and other large asset managers that claim to at least push the needle in the direction of having more social responsibility. Then we think they have price impact, and perhaps that's one way to think about it. But not all investors have price impacts, and definitely if they don't, then perhaps some of this analysis will be less relevant for them. And maybe the last point I want to emphasize is about what you said about tracking errors and how, kind of from a selfish perspective of the asset managers, tilting is beneficial. That's exactly what we're trying to do in the very last point of the paper, emphasizing that if you care about trading profits, the tilting will be even more attractive from the perspective of the investor. So there is kind of additional benefit, and that's why we should not discourage, right? Or we should encourage investors to still fulfill their fiduciary duty to, generate financial returns, and all of that is, we think is super useful to know. So thanks for highlighting that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I can see, so there is some, maybe as we move, maybe to the final Q&A, but I would like perhaps to have one question specifically on this paper. I think there is probably there were a couple in the chat, and then we'll move to kind of a broader Q&A. There were actually a couple of questions and comment in the chat. There was one by Rosalind. So I don't know if you want to ask directly.
Oh, yeah.
You saw that. So maybe I can just. Oh, Rosalind. Oh, yeah, I can see you now. Want to go ahead? So I think she's making a point about some sectors. Go ahead, Rosalind.
Yeah, hi everybody. Sorry. You would think after the pandemic I would master the mute button. So there was one phrase, and I think this is a great paper overall, and it's super interesting, but you made a point about one of the solutions being, looking at the best in class in bad sectors. And so I just wanted to bring this back to sort of the reality and frame it where we're at now with the global, the Glasgow Finance Alliance, where we've got $130 trillion looking at preferring engagement over divestment, and where we've got sectors like coal, where large institutions like BlackRock and Vanguard, who own most of these, and the supporting financiers like Goldman and Liberty Mutual, saying we're going to charge extra to ensure we're going to allocate less of our portfolio. So there is actually a financial impact. So it's I think maybe a misplaced conclusion to assume that people will swoop in and try to purchase brown assets at reduced prices, assuming they'll make a profit, when we know that there's an increased risk of stranded assets and higher cost of capital, and that the world is moving to regulate further in this space. So we've got an interesting time frame of analysis here, looking backwards, where the regulatory frameworks definitely change going forward, certainly from 2021 and beyond. So I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rosalind. I mean, so the way we think about, we definitely think that there is a price impact and that exclusion could have an effect, right? It's literally in our model. It's one of the channels, and we are trading off that against the ability to take corrective action, let's say, in the coal industry. Now, are there any corrective action that can be taken in the coal industry, right, to kind of minimize or reduce the impact, negative impact? I think it's a good question. Maybe the answer is no, in which case, in our framework, it would be as if the corrective action is not very effective, and the model would suggest in those industries you should exclude. You should have like a blanket exclusion. That conclusion would not be inconsistent with the conclusion of the paper. So and the trade-off is might be going into one direction. So I think that's okay. Unfortunately, the paper does not give as much guidance about like which industries the corrective actions are effective and which they are not. I think that's maybe a more empirical question. That's something that maybe more like we need more help from the practitioners, kind of the institutional details, and specifically what can be done like in different industries, perhaps to inform the investment community. But to the extent that you think that there are some corrective actions, we think that the trade-off we highlight is relevant. But no, I think that point is well taken.
Thank you.
If there is, we can probably, move to the general Q&A unless there is a specific question on this paper.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in with just an answer to the last question by Rosalind. Hi, it's a really important question, and I would like it to be that there is this risk of stranded assets and that there would not be brown investors buying up all of these companies. But I think I have unfortunately less faith in government and regulators than many people. We've known about climate change from when I was in school, and there's also a big difference between the companies which are sensitive to the impact of climate and the companies which are contributors. So if you're a real estate company with beachfront properties, you are really concerned about climate change. But if you're an emitting company, unless they have a global carbon tax, then you might be able to get away with it. And there was a very nice analysis, I think, by Shiva Rajgopal and Bob Eccles, which found that some of the largest producers of oil send these companies under. If it was $100 per ton, which is what people think to be fair. And also a lot of these oil companies are national champions. And so just politically, it would be very unlikely for a government to pass some law which is going to cause them to internalize the externalities that they're producing. So unfortunately, I don't have full faith that regulators will cause emitting companies to feel the consequences of their externalities. And as a consequence, there could be a good strategy for some investors with purely financial motives to buy up these brown stocks if they are being divested. Thank
you, Alex.
Could I follow on to Alex's remark just with the observation that there is no world government? So the authors observe that the cost of capital channel is a weak channel, but it's the only global channel. There's no other adjudicating force that can deal with a global systemic issue. Treaties, quasi-governmental organizations, partnerships may have a role, but historically, to Alex's point, they've been quite ineffective. So capital markets, it's their job to understand externalities, and they transmit information globally and quite efficiently. So they do have a social function here that whether or not it fits someone's normative idea of what a market should be from a global or from a systemic perspective, it may be the only mechanism that can be brought into play for some of these problems.
Again, we are transitioning already with the general Q&A. I hope that we have also the author, Jeffrey Gordon with us, and I can see Vasca as well. So we can. I saw actually Pedro had a hand up. I don't know if it was for the last paper or is it more general. Go ahead. In any case,
it's a general point. I think what we label things, you know, and this all discussion between voice and exit and sort of this last paper tilting in the middle. And to Lloyd's point, like, are you a price set? Do you have a price impact or not? Or do you need to form coalitions? Is it possible to form coalitions among investors without without getting into legal trouble as well? So just thinking about that versus the previous paper that Vasco presented, our joint paper, where we think about tilting, you know, in a different way, sort of a traditional engagement versus divestment. So it's just a labeling issue here of this intermediate mechanism of tilting requires sufficient size and maybe sufficient, but will not expose the investors with this size to any problem, right? They could run into problems themselves if they become too big to possibly be able to do so.
If I can maybe connect it to this, I did have a related question, maybe more for, I guess, for the last paper, in terms of, you know, if there is any kind of threshold effect. So because what is, so in a way, what is the tilt? So is there a point below which, again, you only have a representative participation that does not really kind of do anything? Or so is there any size effect in the way you're thinking? Because I think, again, yes, the words are being used slightly different way. And I think as perhaps people might want to move to empirical research based on your model, I think that would be interesting to clarify as well.
So Fabrizio, just to follow up on this, are you wondering about, like, you know, how big the investors must be in some sense in order to have the effects that they have in our model, or maybe I didn't fully get the point?
No, because again, as you're saying, you know, you're participating. I mean, in a firm, again, you can have only the best in class and very tiny participation, or you can go deeper in the distribution. So in a sort of empirically, when people think about ESG tilting, again, there is actually the weights matter a lot. So of course, in the model, probably not, but I guess, is there any, you know, I mean, I'm thinking more perhaps primarily because, okay, how would people go about like kind of leveraging the model in empirical research? And for that would be interesting to expand on that.
No, I hear you. And I think it's somewhat related also to Lynn's point about if you had a portfolio, right? If you have many firms, some could be brown, some could be green. Maybe they are different and on several dimensions. And what would be like the optimal portfolio allocation, accounting for this trade-off, could get us closer to kind of a practical recommendation how to form portfolios. So we haven't done that. That's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Laura, go ahead. Oops, you're muted.
Since I chatted with everybody and said I was trying to come up with the question, I was trying to formulate my question better. So one of the things that today's made me think about is that you know, you have this tilting, but you do have some investors that don't want to be complicit. And so they don't. So how do you convince those investors that they should be in a tilted portfolio instead of a divested portfolio? And this is for any of the authors.
Sorry, Laura, from my end, you sort of cut out halfway through the question. I don't know whether that was just me. You said, how do they be complicit? But I didn't hear the end of that question.
Okay, sorry. So So yeah, I keep getting thrown off. So my question is that there are some investors who invest according to their taste and preferences, and they don't want to be complicit. And so they may not even want to be in a tilted portfolio. So how do you talk to those investors about being in a tilted portfolio? I mean, I guess this is more of a philosophical question, but Alex, you love philosophical questions.
Great. Firstly, sorry for being late. I was at a conference in the Oxford Union, which is why you can see all these pictures in the back. This is not my office with all of these photos, but that's a nice place to talk about philosophical questions. And sort of my answer, my glib answer to your really important question is, through academic research, so this is, I think, sort of why we wanted to write our paper, is yes, you as an investor think you're doing a great job by saying we're so pure, we're not having anything to do with these brown companies. And yes, people already understand if you can engage, you do want to engage with brown companies, but there might be some investors who think, well, engagement is not our expertise. If we're not going to engage, let's just completely divest from them. But if we're showing to them, well, actually, based on this research, you might think that you're helping, but you're not. It's better for you to be in these best-in-class companies. Hopefully that will get them to change. It's like if you're a doctor, you say, look, I'm such a great doctor, none of my patients are sick. Actually, they're probably not doing their job. I do want to work with people who might not be eating healthily, who might not be exercising and so on, even though maybe philosophically, I think people should take care of themselves. It's actually my job as a doctor to look at people who might be not perfect right now. So I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to write the paper, was to say, yes, from a values perspective, yes, you might only be wanting to deal with the most saintly companies, but that's not actually having real impact. It might be that you're working, it might be better for you to work with the companies which are in more problematic industries.
Just to kind of a quick follow-up on this. I mean, it is philosophical in the sense, what are we getting utility from? Making the world better, or shying away from being involved in some activity which we think is immoral or disastrous? So yeah, I think if you have these preferences just to shy away and distance yourself from everything that you think is labeled as bad, you know, and that's where utility is coming from, fine. But is it really, I think the paper is about, is that line of thinking really push us forward in achieving kind of a better place? And I think the answer is could be no. So, but I agree with you.
I have a quick follow-up question for you then, Doran, which is greenwashing overblown? Is greenwashing overblown? Can you be more specific about how would you define greenwashing? Because I think there are different ways to think about it. Okay, I didn't form that very well. Is our concerns, are the concerns about greenwashing overblown in terms of what investors are doing, not corporations?
My gut feeling is no. I actually think that there is a lot of that, but it doesn't mean that we cannot. But because of that, because I do think there is, but this is also an empirical question, there is a lot of greenwashing. This might actually, this concern, which might be justified now, actually prevent investors moving forward and adopting strategies that could actually be beneficial. So the justified concerns we have now are not necessarily, could be counterproductive in the sense that they actually prevent some investors from moving forward. Maybe that, hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I think greenwashing concerns are overblown if by greenwashing you have sort of a black and white idea as to what a responsible investor should do. So if you're saying a responsible investor should only be in the most sort of saintly sectors, then I do think then we shouldn't be so concerned about greenwashing. Also, what's interesting about greenwashing is why are people concerned about it? It's because they say, well, there's investors who don't do what they say they do. But that could apply in many non-ESG contexts. So if I'm in, say, the Jupiter New Financial Opportunities Fund, and I'm not investing in companies which are truly financially innovative, or if I'm in the 91 New Frontiers Fund, and I'm not investing in countries which are really or if I'm a growth stock, what is for funds that don't do what they say do? Whereas one might think that any investor who invests in a fund, which doesn't say what they say that they do, be it a value fund investing in growth stocks, or maybe an actively managed fund.
I think you're breaking down. So I guess we lost Alex.
That underperforms 10 years in a row. You sort of have no protection. Whereas about that, and it's sort of strange how these are treated asymmetrically. So I just released a paper a few days ago called The End of ESG. It's not so much a paper in terms of academic research, but an essay. For some reason, we treat ESG different from other factors. So if you are a regulator who's concerned with...
I think, Alex, you're cutting in and out.
In terms of you don't, that is true for non-ESG funds as much as it is to ESG funds.
Thank you. So let me take actually one question. There is a couple of questions. One from Ricardo. Actually, Rosalind is also raising a similar point about the sort of legitimacy and reputational aspect, I guess, of let's say greenwashing, but also in general of the tilting strategy. You know, if we because. Maybe Ricardo, do you want to raise that?
Yes. So my question is, so even if it's better to, even if it's normatively better for if tilting is better than excluding, I mean, the way a lot of these mutual fund rankings are constructed nowadays, they're based on, the average ESG score of the fund's holdings. So I would assume there's a concern of green funds that market themselves as green, that they have the pressure to actually exclude instead of tilt, right? That's basically the question. So how do you see that in this kind of environment?
Rosalind, do you want to follow up? You also had a similar point, or?
I had a question actually related to the first paper, so I can hold. Okay. But yes, I echo the concern. Greenwashing is a credibility issue, and
so this is not just for the last paper, but I would say also for Vasca or anyone that wants to react to this.
So I guess my question or comment, and I would love for Pedro and Vasca to comment here. So I just want to put in context, the GFANZ, which is the global network under Mark Carney, have standards in their commitments where you actually must practice engagement. It's not a diverse first. But under GFANZ, you are not forced to commit your portfolio's scope 3 emissions, just 1 and 2. Conversely, under the Science-Based Targets Initiative, if you are an asset manager and you commit under science-based targets, you must divest, but the goal is planetary reductions in emissions. And so you must commit your scope 3. So I just wanted to highlight for everybody that this research, which looks backwards, might assume that there is more tilting and less engagement, but that's only because the standards weren't in place. Now that we have 270 firms, $130 trillion of assets, we're seeing a different regulatory environment and different commitments. So when we look at firms like BlackRock and Vanguard, we're looking at what percentage of their portfolios are committed. We're looking at what scopes they're committing those portfolios. So I just wanted to highlight for everybody that I look forward to this research being repeated over the 2030 framework when these large firms have committed to these emissions under this new framework. So we're going to see engagement go up and tilting go down. And yeah, so
thank you.
I'm keen to hear your thoughts.
No, I agree. And I think we definitely want to see what's happening once these engagement initiatives have had some time to play out, because we wanted to do more on engagement, but even the first one, Climate Action 100, one of the oldest, it only starts in 2017. So we couldn't really have it for too much of the period. So that's why we had to focus more on the disclosure angle. But it will be more interesting to see if these are actually effective. But although even in your question, you kind of said that some of them are looking at different measures again. So I wonder if an investor subscribes to both of those and they kind of saying different things, which one would they prioritize and what would be the net impact? And whether these initiatives are coordinating among one another, right?
If you commit to a science-based target and you're a financial institution, you must commit to eliminating your scope 3 emissions. So it's not an alternative choice. The science-based targets are the high bar. My research is in net zero, so I find all of this fascinating. So I'm really, I'd be happy to
I'd love to talk to you also offline. By eliminating, are they kind of more talking about divesting basically, or talking to this company?
Because, they're not talking about divestment because the goal is planetary reduction. And so there is a promotion of providing financing, and the UN's process is really to that, there's a commitment to provide financing to firms to transition. So I'm keen to see this research repeated over the next era to see how this plays out in these same frameworks.
But in relation to the question on reputational concern, I don't know if also Jeffrey Gordon is also connected. Maybe if there is any comment on also the legal aspect. So, but anyone wants to comment on that aspect? That again, despite the fact that we might have certain normative indication from maybe the models, but also perhaps empirical paper, investors might still have a strong either regulatory or even just social normative pressure to divest.
I had one question regarding the normative, this idea of the stewardship.
We are closing in 2 minutes. Yeah, go ahead. But
no, the question was mostly that how does this, the common, it was brought up by the discussant, but the common stewardship idea that corporate governance should be around maximizing the portfolio value versus the individual firm value. How does that relate to all the increasing market power papers that are coming through this exact same idea that common owners are exactly exacerbating market power of firms?
So yeah, I think just to close on that, I know we have to wrap up, Fabrizio. I think the concern is that BlackRock we have had sessions before on anti-ESG, and BlackRock could be under antitrust, or I'm not naming BlackRock specifically, but if you become too large, then this could become an issue. So, and to Rosalind's point, I think this is why we have a conference like this, and we'll continue to have this in the future. And new generations of researchers in this room and many others can keep working on this topic. So we're a little bit behind always in academia. But this is a great call for us to keep going. So thank you for
and maybe if I can add perhaps, and I think this is something that I know that we often, have this plea for collaboration from with asset managers and asset owners and maybe the coalitions of investors, because again, engagement is very hard to capture with the publicly available data. So especially if you're thinking about, we don't even talk about what's going on today. It's even just what happened last 15, 20 years. We have only few data sets available from specific asset managers. So I do think that with all the coalitions, I think, we always have this plea from the PRI Academic Network and all the researchers, to help researchers actually make sense of this by, finding ways of providing this type of data. I think empirically is, it's going to be very, very helpful. And again, just to conclude, I think again, this session was again very great because we also had not only great papers, but we had a theory paper, an empirical paper in finance, and the legal paper in the legal scholarship. So I think that's also a great thing about this conference, because I think I have personally learned a lot today. I hope you have as well, and I invite you to join us tomorrow for the final day of the PRI Academic Week, and Caroline will lead the session, the day on ESG debt, and we have again 3 great papers, coming forward on debt lending and of different kinds. So I think it's going to be another great session. I just want to thank all of you for connecting, all the authors, discussants, and of course, all of the audience. Thank you very much and see you tomorrow.